Before the First Empire existed, the land that would become China lay divided like a cracked mirror. 7 kingdoms stared at one another across shifting borders, each believing it alone carried the right to survive. Years blurred into generations as armies marched, retreated, and returned, leaving villages burned to ash and fields littered with abandoned tools. People grew accustomed to the uneasy rhythm of uncertainty, waking each morning unsure which ruler claimed their loyalty now. Some seasons brought brief peace, yet even calm days felt thin, like fragile silk stretched over hidden fire. Travelers moved carefully along dusty roads, measuring every step by rumor, by smoke on the horizon, by the direction of retreating birds. Farmers buried grain as insurance against marauding soldiers, hoping their hidden stores might outlast the next wave of violence. Children learned early to read distant drums, while elders waited silently, remembering how quickly safety turned to sand. The kingdoms themselves clung to life with the stubbornness of wounded animals, forming alliances that broke as swiftly as they were sworn. Diplomats whispered in candlelit halls, generals plotted beneath war banners, and rulers waited for omens that might give them one more season of advantage. Yet beneath all this noise lived a quieter truth. No kingdom trusted its own strength, and none believed the land could ever be whole again. Scholars wandered from court to court, seeking patrons who often fell in battle before they finished a single teaching. Poets described the age as a long night, a darkness that deepened without promise of dawn. Even the rivers seemed restless, carrying fragments of ruined towns downstream like reminders of how fragile order had become. And yet, in the midst of this exhaustion, a strange anticipation grew, as if the land itself sensed that the chaos had reached its peak. People whispered that a change was coming, not born of luck or diplomacy, but of a force far more decisive. Rumors drifted across the plains about a rising power in the west, a kingdom sharpening itself while others bled. No one knew the young ruler who had begun tightening his borders, yet stories hinted at a mind shaped by silence more than ceremony. Some said he trusted no smile, no promise, no tradition that failed to serve the future he envisioned. Others claimed he watched the chaos not with despair, but with a cold understanding that disorder was simply a problem waiting for a precise answer. In every village, people repeated the same quiet question, unsure whether to fear the possibility or welcome it. Could one person truly pull a fractured land back into a single shape? The question lingered like smoke over a dying fire, unanswered yet impossible to ignore. As the kingdoms drifted toward exhaustion, the stage quietly formed for someone who saw unity not as conquest, but as the only antidote to collapse. In that fading moment between turmoil and surrender, history waited for a figure bold enough to reshape its direction for the land. Yingzheng entered the world not into warmth, but into suspicion. His earliest memories unfolded inside chambers, where silence carried more meaning than speech, and where every shadow seemed aware of him. The palace in which he grew was vast, yet none of its long corridors offered comfort. Guards stood watch not out of devotion but out of fear, for his lineage was tangled in rumors murmured behind closed screens. Some questioned his father, others whispered about his mother. No explanation ever reached the young boy. He learned instead to interpret glances, pauses, and the careful distance maintained by adults who treated him less as a child and more as a potential symbol for ambitions not yet declared. The walls enclosing him were high, built to keep assassins at bay, but they also sealed him from any sense of ordinary life. Servants moved like drifting smoke, avoiding direct eye contact, as though accidental familiarity carried risk. Ministers bowed deeply, yet their eyes followed him with a quiet wariness, as if searching for signs of the ruler he might become. The boy absorbed these tensions without understanding their origins. He learned early that affection came with consequences, and that trust invited danger. Nights were filled with muffled footsteps, doors closing too quickly, and a lingering sense that something unseen waited just beyond the lamplight. In that environment, emotion became a luxury. He instinctively denied himself. As he grew older, Yingzheng discovered that knowledge was often withheld from him, not because he was unimportant, but because he mattered too much. Every gesture he made seemed to ripple through the palace like a small stone disturbing still water. Tutors corrected him gently but observed him intensely, as though measuring how he processed each lesson. When he walked through the palace gardens, attendants followed at a respectful distance. Yet even in that space meant for calm, He sensed that every breath he took was recorded by someone's cautious memory. The boy understood that anything revealing weakness or softness could be used against him. The world had taught him early that survival depended on vigilance, restraint, and a careful reading of silence. In this quiet pressure, a strange clarity formed. Yingzheng began viewing time not as something to enjoy, but as something to command. Each passing day felt like a test of whether he would succumb to the circumstances crafted around him or rise above them. The absence of childhood freedoms shaped a mind that valued control over comfort or certainty over warmth. He grew into someone who believed that hesitation invited collapse and that emotion clouded judgment. The palace had not nurtured him. It had refined him, carving away softness until only resolve remained. When he finally stepped beyond those isolating walls, he carried with him a conviction forged by secrecy. Only absolute power could prevent the world from consuming itself once more. Yingzheng ascended the throne, while still caught between childhood and something far sharper, a liminal age where the world first reveals its teeth. The great hall awaiting him was filled with ministers whose robes rustled like unsettled birds, their expressions disciplined yet restless. They expected a pliable boy who would nod at the right moments and sign whatever edicts they prepared, a figurehead raised by circumstance rather than strength. Yet the young king entered with a stillness that unsettled them. He did not bow or fidget, he simply watched. His gaze moved from one cautious face to another, absorbing subtle movements, unspoken alliances, and the fragile confidence of men who believed they controlled the future simply because they had survived the past. He listened to their ritual greetings with a quiet that felt less like uncertainty and more like assessment. Every phrase offered to him carried hidden meanings, and he gathered them carefully, noticing which minister spoke with forced warmth and which avoided his eyes altogether. Though he had inherited the throne only days earlier, he already understood that power did not flow from the crown resting on his head, but from the interpretations others made of his silence, so he let the silence stretch. It coiled gently through the chamber, tightening around men unaccustomed to being studied. When he finally spoke, his voice was unhurried, almost soft, yet every syllable carried the clarity of someone who recognized the exact moment a room began to fold toward him. The ministers had hoped to guide him with subtle nudges, but they soon discovered that the boy's mind moved in directions they could not predict. Yingzheng requested reports not on battles or taxes but on personnel, asking which officials had shifted allegiances recently and which households had increased their guard numbers without imperial instruction. His questions, calm and seemingly harmless, caused uneasy glances to pass between seasoned statesmen. In private meetings he invited men to speak freely, then watched how their confidence rose or faltered. Each conversation became a quiet test. Those who believed his youth made him malleable revealed themselves quickly. Those who measured their words with care were marked for tasks requiring patience. The young king saw through postures long before anyone realized he was studying them. He began by rearranging small elements of the court, choices that seemed insignificant, yet changed the currents of influence. Messenger routes were altered, ensuring that information reached him before it reached anyone else. Guards were reassigned under the guise of routine rotation, but the new placements allowed him to observe which ministers reacted with discomfort. He promoted low-ranking officials whose diligence had gone unnoticed, not because he trusted them fully, but because their gratitude created openings in places previously closed. All of this unfolded slowly, quietly, without theatrical announcements. The ministers believed they still shaped the realm, unaware that the young ruler was gently reweaving threads they had held for decades. Even those skeptical of his potential sensed something shifting beneath the surface, a momentum that had not existed before. At night, when the palace corridors dimmed and distant torches flickered like drifting stars, Yingzheng walked alone through the silent courtyards. These solitary walks were not escapes but studies. He observed which windows still glowed with lamplight, which servants whispered too eagerly, which guards stiffened at his approach. The palace was a maze of ambitions hidden behind ceremonial courtesy, and he learned to read it the way others read maps. The more he watched, the more he understood that ruling required an attentiveness greater than strength. Power was not the roar of authority, but the soft gathering of knowledge who feared whom, who relied on rumor, who moved pieces no one else noticed. These quiet discoveries became the foundation upon which he would build everything else. Whispers began circulating among the elder ministers that the young king was not as pliable as they hoped. Some attributed his composure to naivety, assuming confidence would unravel once he faced true political weight. Yet others sensed the danger in underestimating someone who revealed so little. Yingzheng continued, altering the arrangement of influence, never abruptly, always in increments too small to challenge directly. He dismissed certain attendants quietly, replacing them with individuals loyal not through fear but through opportunity. He requested documents previously deemed too complex for someone his age, and studied them with diligence that unsettled his advisors. Every action, though gentle, pressed outward, testing the boundaries of what the court believed he was allowed to control. With each test, those boundaries shifted slightly. Gradually, Yingzheng began to shape decisions that influenced the wider kingdom. He summoned regional officers who had never been invited to the capital, and asked them questions that revealed his growing understanding of the realm's vulnerabilities. Problems ignored for years were suddenly addressed with precision. Roads damaged by seasonal floods were repaired ahead of schedule. Supply lines disrupted by corrupt officials were tightened until accountability became unavoidable. None of these measures announced themselves as grand reforms, yet together they signaled an emerging intention. The boy on the throne was learning how to command a state not by spectacle, but by steady rebalancing. Those observing him realized too late that he was no longer reacting to the world around him. He was beginning to adjust it. By the time the ministers recognized the shift, the chamber that once overwhelmed him responded to his presence instead. He understood who doubted him, who feared change, and who watched for opportunity. His early reign did not thunder. It accumulated, quiet but deliberate, outlining authority no one had expected from someone his age. Beneath that calm surface, a deeper intention formed, shaped by memories of division and a childhood lived inside guarded walls. Yingzheng sensed that the power he now held was only the beginning. Beyond the capital, the other kingdoms continued their rivalries, unaware that their long struggle was already bending toward a single, emerging will, whether they fully realized it. Before Qin rose to prominence, its reforms began as quiet disruptions that slipped into daily life before anyone understood their reach. Shangyang's vision did not announce itself with grand speeches, but with simple rules that redefined how people moved, worked, and even thought. Laws that once flexed with circumstance hardened into fixed expectations. Small offences brought punishments that felt shockingly precise. Families watched these changes with a growing mixture of fear and reluctant admiration, sensing that the kingdom had chosen a new direction where discipline replaced tradition. At first, many believed the reforms would fade like countless earlier edicts, yet they instead tightened with each passing season. Farmers discovered they were now evaluated not by lineage but by measurable yield, a shift that unsettled families accustomed to ancestral privilege. Land that once belonged to noble houses fractured into smaller plots, awarded to those who proved their worth through labor. Such changes felt radical, but they also offered opportunity to people long ignored. The social landscape rearranged itself quickly, forming patterns that rewarded efficiency over sentiment. For soldiers, the reforms struck with equal force. The battlefield ceased to be a stage for noble lineage, and became instead a ledger of quantifiable achievement. Merit determined advancement. Bravery brought tangible reward. Hesitation carried visible cost. Many who once expected recognition merely for their birth now found themselves overshadowed by men whose skill emerged from hardship, not heritage. This transformation forged an army that moved with unified purpose, each soldier motivated by a system that acknowledged effort with a clarity unprecedented in the fractured world beyond Qin's borders. But the deepest impact settled in the ordinary households scattered across the kingdom. Families accustomed to flexible customs suddenly lived under rules that tolerated no exceptions. Neighbors who once settled disputes informally now faced officials documenting missteps with unnerving diligence. The punishments, though systematic, felt harsh to people accustomed to ambiguity. Yet beneath the fear, some sensed the strange comfort of predictability. Order, even when severe, offered a stability absent for generations. Every household adjusted, slowly learning that compliance brought safety, and that hesitation risked consequences the law no longer softened. These reforms did more than strengthen Qin. They subtly reshaped the emotional fabric of its people. Life grew sharper, more focused, stripped of the indulgences that had once softened hardship. The new order demanded alertness, rewarding those who adapted quickly and punishing those who hesitated. Under this pressure, a distinct mindset formed, one that valued precision, discipline, and obedience. Even those who feared the system could not deny its results. Markets ran more efficiently, disputes resolved faster, and officials became instruments of a structure too interconnected to resist. This shift revealed the essence of Xiangyang's design, a kingdom bound together by the certainty of consequence. Yet within this tightening framework, something else emerged, an unspoken understanding that would later shape Yingzheng's rule. He watched these reforms from within the palace, observing how they hardened his kingdom into a tool capable of cutting through centuries of fragmentation. From his vantage point, the changes did not seem cruel but necessary, a methodical answer to the chaos that had swallowed generations before him. He saw how fear could motivate as effectively as hope, and how structure could forge unity where persuasion failed. The reforms were more than laws. They were a demonstration of what discipline could achieve when enforced without hesitation. As the kingdom transformed, so did the young ruler's beliefs. He grew convinced that control, once firmly established, could guide a fractured world toward a single, unbreakable future, one that waited just beyond the borders of Qin. Yingzheng's army did not emerge from tradition but from calculation, shaped slowly through reforms that stripped warfare of ritual and replaced it with repeatable precision. Before his rise, most kingdoms relied on feudal militias whose loyalty shifted with lineage, mood, or the fortunes of local lords. Qin rejected that instability. Its new force drew strength from the state itself, binding soldiers to a structure that rewarded measurable results. Training grounds filled with recruits who learned movement not as chaos, but as rhythm. When formations advanced, they moved like a single breath, steady, aligned, and unnervingly calm. Uniformity became the kingdom's quiet advantage. Armor was no longer crafted individually, but molded from a template that ensured every warrior fit seamlessly into the unit beside him. Shields matched height and curvature. Spear shafts held identical weight. Helmets echoed the same austere shape. This standardization created a strange elegance on the battlefield, a sense that Qin soldiers belonged to an order greater than themselves. Their movements revealed nothing personal, no flourish, no hesitation, only purpose. Watching them march felt less like observing men, and more like witnessing the slow turn of some engineered mechanism designed for inevitability. At the heart of this transformation lay a merit system that quietly dismantled the old aristocratic hierarchy. Officers rose not because of their ancestry, but through headcount, the grim, numerical measure of battlefield success. Brutal as it was, the clarity of this rule altered ambition across the ranks. Soldiers understood exactly what advancement required, and in turn, discipline intensified. Units became sharper, hungrier, compelled by rewards that felt attainable rather than inherited. This shift frightened rival states, who still clung to family-based privilege. Qin's army was dangerous, not only because it fought well, but because it believed effort alone could reorder destiny. Yet, equipment mattered as much as discipline. Qin's crossbows, engineered with meticulous consistency, delivered bolts with force unmatched by neighboring armies. Siege engines rolled forward with deliberate weight, their frames reinforced to withstand repeated assaults. Cavalry units, too, became sharper tools under the new system, taught to coordinate movements with infantry in ways that turned battles into choreographed storms. None of these innovations belonged solely to Qin, but Qin alone fused them into a coherent method. War ceased to feel improvised. It became organized pressure, applied with unsettling regularity, until even strongholds that believed themselves secure found their confidence thinning under the rhythm of attack. To those living through this shift, the change felt both empowering and ominous. Veterans who had once relied on personal renown now found themselves part of something larger, moving according to signals and patterns that left little room for individual display. New recruits, drawn from farms and small towns, learned early that survival depended on synchronizing with the group. The training grounds echoed with commands repeated until instinct replaced thought. The resulting cohesion gave Qin an advantage no rival kingdom could easily counter. When thousands advanced together, they did so with the quiet certainty of people who trusted the system shaping them. Beyond the training fields, the reputation of Qin's army spread with unsettling speed. Travelers carried stories of regiments that moved with unbroken lines, of commanders who executed orders without hesitation, and of battles that ended before rival forces fully understood the strategy unfolding against them. These tales were not exaggerated. They reflected a new philosophy in which warfare resembled a calculation more than a gamble. Each soldier became a variable, each formation a deliberate equation. Victory grew less dependent on chance or charisma and more on the disciplined application of predictable force. Such reliability made Qin a threat even before the first campaign truly began. Within this tightening machine, the soldiers themselves seemed transformed into extensions of a distant will. Orders issued in the capital translated into coordinated action hundreds of miles away, as if the kingdom possessed a single nervous system. This cohesion unsettled Qin's rivals more than sheer numbers ever could. They saw an army that appeared tireless, unified, and strangely indifferent to the uncertainties that plagued traditional warfare. What marched toward them was not merely a force of men, but a structure built to continue advancing long after hesitation should have taken hold for long. The road to unification began not with a roar, but with a quiet movement of pieces, each placed with the precision of someone who viewed the world as a map waiting to be redrawn. Han, the weakest of the remaining kingdoms, became the first stone Yingzheng chose to lift. To many observers, the decision appeared predictable, even convenient. But the young king did not see Han merely as a vulnerable neighbor. He saw it as the gateway through which the greater transformation must pass. The conquest was not revenge, nor ambition, nor restless hunger. It was a necessary opening, the first adjustment in a long sequence that would alter the rhythm of the entire land. Qin's preparations unfolded in layers invisible to foreign eyes. Before the first battalion marched, networks of spies threaded themselves through markets, inns, river docks, and minor courts. They noted supply shortages, discontent among minor officials, weaknesses in fortifications, and tensions between local commanders. These reports traveled back to the capital with the quiet consistency of a pulse, forming a foundation for decisions made with near-clinical clarity. Diplomatic envoys followed, not to negotiate peace, but to measure reactions, test anxieties, and quietly steer Han's leadership toward uncertainty. Even engineers had their part, studying river routes and mountain passes long before the army arrived, ensuring that movement would be swift rather than improvised. When Qin forces finally advanced, they did so with a calmness that unnerved those watching from distant walls. Instead of chaotic drums or hurried marches, the army moved in measured waves, crossing rivers with almost ceremonial stillness. Bridges assembled by engineering corps appeared where none had been the week before. Supply caravans moved in parallel lines, following roads carved through stubborn terrain months earlier. The invasion resembled the unfolding of a design long complete, rather than the start of a war. To the people of Han, this quiet inevitability was more frightening than noise. Battle cries could be resisted, inevitability could not. Cities along the frontier braced themselves, uncertain whether resistance would be punished or surrender rewarded. Gates that once guarded proud communities now seemed thin against the horizon, darkening with Qin banners. Yet the most striking feature of the invasion was not violence but timing. Garrisons fell before they understood their isolation. Commanders discovered their reinforcements delayed by supply lines Qin had disrupted subtly, long in advance. Roads expected to offer escape had already been severed by detachments that moved at night. Siege engines assembled beyond arrow range appeared before defenders even realized the ground had been cleared for them. Each event felt less like attack and more like pieces sliding into positions already determined. Inside the capital of Han, fear deepened as reports arrived too quickly to ignore. Ministers whispered of betrayal, spies, divine warnings, anything that might explain how Qin's advance seemed to fold the kingdom inward. But Yingzheng was not relying on fear. He relied on precision. He had studied the fractures running through the region and pressed exactly where the structure could no longer bear weight. He treated Han not as an adversary to crush, but as a component that, once removed from its old place, could be fitted into a new alignment. This mindset gave his commanders clarity. Victories were not triumphs, they were progress. Surrender was not mercy, it was efficiency. When Han finally collapsed, it did so with a quietness that felt ceremonial. A king was captured, officials were absorbed, and the territory became part of Qin's expanding body without the prolonged devastation that had marked wars of earlier generations. For people living through the transition, the change felt more like being pulled into a stronger current than being conquered. The kingdom did not fall because its defenses broke. It fell because Yingzheng had already stepped beyond the older logic of warfare. He operated from a perspective that saw the future as something to be assembled piece by piece, not chased through battlefields. And as Han dissolved into Qin's structure, neighboring kingdoms watched with a tightening sense of apprehension. They saw that the success was not luck or overwhelming force, but the unveiling of a strategy decades in formation. Qin was no longer competing in the familiar contest of borders and alliances. It was moving according to a different pattern, one that made resistance feel increasingly futile. The first conquest had ended, but its meaning had only begun to register. What awaited them was not a series of wars, they realized, but the reshaping of history itself. Zhao had always been a kingdom shaped by hardship. Situated on the northern frontier, it had endured more clashes with nomadic tribes and rival states than almost any land in China. Its people were known for their endurance, its soldiers for their grit, and its generals for their unshakable discipline. Even as Qin grew into a sharpened blade of ambition, Zhao carried itself with the confidence of an old warrior scarred, limping slightly, but still standing. Its capital, Handan, rose above the plains like a memory of better ages, a reminder that Zhao had survived storms that would have shattered lesser kingdoms. Pride, more than policy, kept the nation upright. Yet beneath that pride, something fragile had begun to spread. The fields outside Handan were no longer as fertile as they once had been. Years of conflict drained the soil and the people who worked it. Families buried their dead with fewer tears, not because they cared less, but because mourning had become a rhythm too familiar to ignite fresh grief. The once vaunted Zhao cavalry, famous across the realms, now struggled to maintain its numbers. Horses were harder to feed, and the cost of training new riders weighed heavily on local noble households already stretched thin. Inside the capital, Handan's market still bustled, but the noise carried an undertone of anxiety. Merchants watched Qin's rise, with the same uneasy vigilance one reserves for a distant cloud that grows darker each day. Officials argued in quiet rooms, each debate circling the same realization. Zhao's strength was real, but no longer absolute. The kingdom had built its reputation on resistance, on holding firm against stronger enemies, but now a new kind of threat approached a force not made of brute courage, but of disciplined inevitability. Qin's armies did not swagger or boast, they simply advanced. That quiet certainty unnerved even Zhao's bravest. When Qin marched toward Handan, the approach felt less like the start of a siege and more like the slow lowering of a lid. The armies crossing the plains moved with disturbing coordination, their formations steady even under long days of travel. Handan's defenders watched from the walls, gripping their spears with familiar resolve, yet sensing something different about this enemy. Qin did not shout challenges or taunts. They constructed lines, positioned engines, and prepared their encirclement with a calmness that suggested the outcome had been decided before the first arrow flew. Inside the city, fear and defiance mingled. Families gathered in shadowed corners, whispering stories of Zhao's past victories, as if repeating them might summon forgotten strength. Generals who had once ridden fearlessly across open fields now walked the ramparts in silence, their faces lined not with cowardice, but with a dawning sense that the rules of war had changed. They could see that Qin's strength did not depend on heroic feats or fortunate timing. It came from structure, from relentless order, from a system that had been hardening for decades. Zhao's courage was real, but it belonged to another age. As the siege tightened, the rhythm of life within Handan grew eerie. Water was rationed, fires were kept small, conversations felt muted, as if the entire population was holding its breath. The nights were especially heavy. No drunken songs rose from taverns, no clatter of late-night markets, only the distant creak of siege engines being positioned, their silhouettes crouched like patient beasts beyond the walls. Children were told to stay indoors, their parents fearful that even the sound of play might attract unwanted attention. A few desperate attempts to break the siege failed, each thwarted not by overwhelming force, but by the precision of Qin's response. Zhao's soldiers fought with the bravery expected of them, yet they found themselves hemmed in by strategies too cohesive, too prepared, too synchronized to unravel. For every breach Zhao attempted, Qin reacted with calm efficiency, closing openings before momentum could form. It became clear that Qin had studied Zhao's strengths thoroughly and respected them enough to neutralize them completely. When Handan finally weakened, it happened quietly. Food ran low, morale thinned, and the city's once fierce eyes dimmed. Zhao's defenses did not collapse in dramatic fashion. They simply bent until their shape no longer held. The fall was not a single event, but a series of small concessions. A gate unmanned for a moment too long, a battalion exhausted beyond repair, a final council where even the bravest generals lowered their voices when speaking the truth. In the end, Zhao did not bow out of cowardice. It bowed because time had eroded what resistance alone could sustain. To the surrounding kingdoms, Zhao's fall sent tremors deeper than any battlefield defeat. If the kingdom that prided itself on resilience could not resist Qin, what hope did the others have? The map of China seemed to tilt at that moment, pulling every remaining state toward a fate they had hoped to delay. The collapse of Zhao was not merely a military loss, it was a message. The ground beneath the old world was shifting, and no kingdom, not even the proudest, stood beyond its reach. Yan and Wei had always lived in the shadow of stronger neighbors, but never had the shadow stretched so wide or so dark as when Qin began swallowing the map piece by piece. Both kingdoms felt the tremor left by Zhao's fall, and suddenly the distance between them and Qin seemed measured not in miles, but in time running out. Their rulers summoned advisors in tightly sealed chambers, hoping late-night whispers might birth solutions bold enough to halt the inevitable. Couriers rode through the night carrying messages encoded in hurried strokes, their breath frosting in the cold air as if even the sky wanted to conceal their intentions. Alliances were discussed, then doubted, then revived out of desperation. Every decision felt like a gamble played with trembling hands. Yan, cornered between fear and fading pride, chose a path that reflected both courage and despair. The court knew military resistance would crumble quickly under Qin's disciplined advance, so they sought something sharper, more unpredictable, the edge of a single blade. Thus entered Jing Ke, a figure who would step into history not as a warrior of armies, but as a man entrusted with altering the future through one irreversible act. The plan was crafted in a dim hall lit by torches that flickered like uneasy hearts. A forged map, a concealed dagger, and a promise that the fate of nations might shift in the span of a single heartbeat. When Jing Ke approached Yingzheng, the tension in the air felt thick enough to slow movement itself. The hall was quiet, almost reverent, but beneath that calm lay a strain so intense it could have shattered glass. Jing Ke's hand tightened around the rolled map that hid the weapon. The young king stepped forward, curious, his expression one of guarded interest rather than fear. For a moment, time narrowed to a thin thread, just the faint rasp of parchment, the soft intake of breath, the glint of metal emerging from its hiding place. Then the thread snapped. The attempt failed, not because Jing Ke lacked resolve, but because Yingzheng reacted with a speed that would be retold for centuries. A twist, a step back. A pulse of instinct honed in childhood corridors where danger was never far. Guards intervened, and the hall returned to silence, though its stillness had changed. Instead of relief, it radiated a renewed, sharpened resolve. The failure echoed across the kingdoms. In Yan, hope withered like frostbitten leaves. They had wagered everything on a single moment, and when the moment passed, nothing remained but the creeping certainty of Qin's approach. Resistance dissolved into scattered attempts at defense, each too small to matter. The kingdom weakened visibly, its borders shrinking like a breath pulled tight and never released. Wei, meanwhile, faced a slower kind of suffocation. There were no dramatic assassinations, no desperate gestures that would etch their story into legend. For Wei, the fall came through steady erosion, fortresses lost without ceremony, commanders surrendering after long internal debates, and farmland slipping under Qin control, one valley at a time. The kingdom still held meetings, still issued decrees, still spoke of strategy, but every step felt more like postponement than resistance. Submission arrived softly, disguised as pragmatism, until finally Wei stood not as a rival, but as a remnant absorbed into the structure of Qin's expanding design. Together, Yan and Wei revealed the fragility of kingdoms trapped between fear and fading options. One sought salvation through a moment of impossible bravery, the other through endurance that slowly thinned into resignation. Both paths ended the same way. not with triumphant cries or decisive battles, but with the quiet recognition that Qin's rise had already surpassed their imagination. Their gambles, bold or cautious, were too late. And as their stories folded into the past, the remaining kingdoms felt the shift. The map was changing faster now, drawn by a hand that no longer hesitated. Chu was unlike any kingdom Qin had faced before, vast, humid, filled with deep forests and rivers that wound through fertile plains like veins of emerald. Its culture carried a softness that belied its strength. Poetry inscribed on silk, musicians who played melodies shaped by the movement of water, warriors painted in vivid colors before entering battle. To many, Chu felt less like a state and more like a world unto itself. But beauty does not shield against time, and beneath Chu's abundance lay old fractious nobles who mistrusted one another, ministers divided by personal rivalries, and reforms spoken of often yet acted upon rarely. It was a kingdom rich in spirit but slow in adaptation, and Qin understood that difference with a clarity Chu's own court lacked. When Qin's armies approached Chu, they did not rush. They moved like a steady tightening of the horizon. Forts along the border were cut off quietly. River crossings were secured before anyone realized their significance. Villages that once heard only the songs of nature began to hear distant construction, the rhythmic pounding of engineers assembling bridges and siege platforms with the patience of craftsmen, not conquerors. Chu's generals, brave but constrained by political interference, found their movements hindered by nobles reluctant to cede authority. Strategies that required swift unity became tangled in debates, and by the time decisions were made, Qin had already adjusted, already advanced, already closed one more route of escape. Within Chu's capital, worry travelled faster than messages. Traders from the north spoke of Qin's unbroken lines, of soldiers who marched without falter even through the heat of Chu's southern climate. Ministers met in chambers scented with incense, their shadows wavering on lacquered walls as they argued over whether alliances could still save them. Some urged for diplomatic bridges, others demanded immediate resistance, yet all sensed the same unsettling truth. Qin's campaign carried an inevitability that felt strangely impersonal, like a law of nature, rather than the ambition of men. When battle finally came, Chu's warriors fought with valiant fury. Their chariots cut through marshland and open field, their archers loosed arrows in volleys that darkened the sky, and their generals stood at the front with the pride of a nation that had never imagined defeat. But Qin's formations responded with calm synchronization, absorbing each assault with a precision that drained hope. What exhausted Chu energized Qin. What startled Chu seemed anticipated by Qin. Slowly, steadily, the great kingdom that once believed itself too large to fall began to realize that size meant nothing if unity faltered. When Chu's defenses finally collapsed, it happened not through dramatic ruin, but through gradual, undeniable constriction. The kingdom's spirit remained fierce, but its structure had worn too thin to withstand the weight upon it. Qi, on the other hand, experienced a different fate entirely. Wealthy, refined, and comfortably distant from Qin's initial campaigns, Qi convinced itself that its turn would come last, if at all. Its rulers misread Qin's silence as disinterest. While neighboring states scrambled to strengthen armies and fortify borders, Qi invested in courtly pleasures, philosophical debates, and commercial expansion. The kingdom saw the world not as it was becoming, but as it had been a dangerous luxury in a time of accelerating change. Even as Qin toppled Zhao, shattered Yan's hopes, and eroded Wei's defenses, Qi clung to the belief that diplomacy or distance would protect it. Ministers reassured their king that Qin would avoid confronting such a prosperous realm. They claimed the kingdom's wealth made it too valuable to destroy. But wealth without vigilance becomes a weight rather than a weapon. When Qin finally turned its gaze eastward, the campaign unfolded with unsettling ease. Roads already mapped, corridors of influence already understood, Qi's defenses stood untested and unprepared. No great battles broke out, no heroic last stands were made. The gates opened not to triumphant invaders, but to the quiet realization that resistance had been forfeited long before the first soldier appeared on the horizon. The richest kingdom fell with barely a whisper, undone not by Qin's force but by its own certainty. In that silence, a deeper message emerged. Power fades not only through defeat, but through waiting too long to act. Qi's collapse was a reminder that history does not pause for hesitation. With Chu subdued and Qi dissolved into memory, the map of China narrowed into a single shape. All barriers had fallen. All rivals lay behind. And as Qin absorbed the last fragments of the old order, the world sensed a new moment approaching the birth of an empire that would redefine time itself. When Yingzheng finally stood over a unified land, the silence that followed felt heavier than any victory cry. Years of campaigns had carved new borders, absorbed ancient rivals, and reshaped the map into something no generation before had imagined. But the young king sensed that conquest alone was not enough. To unify territory was one thing. To unify identity, memory, and time itself required something deeper. He needed a title that broke with every structure the past had allowed. And so, in a ceremony veiled in solemn ritual, Yingzheng named himself Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, an announcement that seemed to ripple outward like a stone dropped into still water. The hall in which he proclaimed the title held an atmosphere thick with anticipation. Ministers dressed in formal robes bowed low, though many felt unease prickling beneath their reverence. They understood what the title meant. In calling himself Huangdi, the emperor placed himself not within the hierarchy of kings, but above it, beyond precedent, beyond comparison. He reached backward into myth and pulled a name that once belonged to semi-divine rulers. It was a declaration that the age of competing states had ended, and a new era, centered on one man, had begun. No ruler in China had ever attempted such a shift. Outside the palace, the world did not erupt in immediate celebration. There were no festivals, no widespread chanting of a new age. Instead, the change settled slowly into daily life, like a season altering the color of leaves. The emperor's decree transformed language. First terms once used for rulers, courts, and territories were replaced with new words that aligned all authority beneath a single center. The empire became a body, its limbs stretching across mountains, plains, and coastlines, all connected by the pulse of the emperor's will. For ordinary people, the transformation was subtle at first, but unmistakable. Old measurements were recalibrated. Documents adopted new script standards. The calendar itself shifted, with the emperor's reign becoming the point from which years were counted. This recentering of time revealed the enormity of his ambition. In redefining the calendar, Qin Shi Huang signaled that history before him belonged to a separate age, one now closed. He was not simply ruling the present, he was shaping the past and claiming the future. It was a psychological consolidation of power, one that reached far deeper than military strength. To count time from his rule was to place every life within the empire under his chronology. Farmers, merchants, soldiers, scholars, every birth, every harvest, every death was recorded under years that bore his stamp. A unified land became a unified timeline. Yet the moment itself remained strangely quiet. There was something eerie about the calm surrounding such a monumental decision. In this muted transition, the weight of his declaration felt heavier than if it had been accompanied by trumpets or banners. It suggested not celebration, but inevitability, as though history had been waiting for someone willing to seize it fully. Qin Shi Huang did not need noise to announce dominance. He needed only the certainty of his presence. Across the empire, the shift in identity continued to unfold. Local lords, who once commanded regions with near-royal authority, now found their titles reduced to administrative ranks. The emperor changed how officials were selected, how records were kept, and how the state envisioned itself. People who had grown up loyal to their kingdom now became subjects of something vast and unfamiliar. The transformation caused unease, but it also created a strange unity. Bound together, under a title that stretched across the known world, the diverse cultures of the former warring states slowly began to imagine themselves as part of a single civilization. With the declaration complete and the empire newly defined, Qin Shi Huang turned his gaze toward the next challenge. Conquest had given him territory, but now he faced something far more complex, reshaping every corner of life within the empire so that it reflected his vision rather than the world he had inherited. The creation of the first emperor was only the beginning. The remaking of the empire would demand even more. The unification of China did not truly begin on the battlefield. It began in the quieter realm of systems, those hidden structures that decide how people write, trade, measure, travel, and interpret authority. Qin Shi Huang understood something few rulers before him had grasped. To rule millions, he did not need to meet them. He needed only to standardize the world through which they moved. And so, After declaring himself the first emperor, he turned not to celebration, but to calibration. The empire he inherited was enormous, stitched together from states that had once considered one another enemies. Each region carried its own customs, weights, and bureaucratic habits. Even the writing, the essential script of administration, shifted subtly from one state to the next, creating friction in communication and governance. The emperor saw these inconsistencies as remnants of the chaos that had shaped his childhood. They were weaknesses, soft patches in the newly formed structure he intended to harden. And so he began to smooth, erase, and unify. The most transformative change emerged through script reform. Scholars were summoned and instructed to create a standardized form of writing, clear, consistent, efficient. Dozens of local variants dissolved overnight, leaving a single, official script that bureaucrats from any province could interpret. This shift was more than linguistic. It was psychological. When a merchant carried a document across the empire, he no longer worried whether the next official would decipher it. When a minor administrator read an imperial decree, he encountered characters shaped exactly like those used in distant territories. Words became bridges, and through them, the emperor's voice traveled unbroken across mountains and rivers. Currency followed. Gone were the distinct shapes of regional coins, replaced by round coins with square centers, the Banliang design. Their uniform weight turned the empire's markets into synchronized systems. A farmer in the old state of Chu now traded with the same currency as a merchant in former Wei. What had once been a patchwork of small economies slowly merged into a single financial rhythm. Traders felt the change immediately. Where confusion had once slowed negotiations, clarity now sped them forward. Every transaction, no matter how small, carried the subtle imprint of imperial intention. Measurements, too, transformed. The emperor abolished local units and enforced a universal standard. This seemed simple at first: 1 foot, 1 weight, 1 volume. But its effect rippled outward. Builders constructed homes with predictable proportions. Engineers coordinated across regions without adjusting for local quirks. Markets measured grain using identical containers. Even tools shared the same dimensions. The empire's vastness suddenly felt less overwhelming. Predictability replaced uncertainty, and the emperor's logic seeped into daily routines without fanfare. Perhaps the most overlooked reform was the standardization of axle widths. Carts from different regions had been built to different sizes, carving inconsistent grooves into the roads and slowing travel. By mandating a universal axle width, the emperor ensured that every cart, military, commercial, agricultural, moved within the same ruts. The roads became self-reinforcing channels guiding the empire's movement. Messages traveled faster, supplies flowed seamlessly, soldiers marched without obstruction. A simple mechanical standard subtly bound distant cities into a unified system. These reforms, combined with new taxation structures and administrative hierarchies, reshaped the empire from the inside. Local identities began to blur as the rhythms of daily life synchronized. A potter in the east used the same measurements as a mason in the west. A magistrate in the north filed reports identical in format to those used in the south. The empire became legible: one set of rules, one set of standards, one center that defined the whole. But beneath this efficiency lay a deeper motive. Qin Shi Huang understood that standardization did more than simplify governance. It infused obedience without direct force. When every aspect of life followed the same structure, deviation felt unnatural. People who grew accustomed to uniformity were less inclined to question authority that shaped that uniformity. The emperor's power became an invisible presence, woven into every market stall, every road, every written character. Control, achieved quietly, lasted longer than control imposed through fear alone. As these systems settled into place, the empire began to resemble a single organism, its limbs coordinated by a central will, its heartbeat steady, its pathways clear. The chaos of the warring states faded like a distant storm. In its place rose an ordered world crafted piece by piece, calibrated with the precision of someone determined never again to live in uncertainty. With this internal order established, the emperor turned his gaze toward projects that would reshape the land itself. Monuments meant not just to unify the present, but to imprint his vision upon the very bones of the earth. Long before the empire could feel whole, it needed a skeleton, a framework capable of binding distant regions into a single pulse. Qin Shi Huang understood this, with an instinct sharpened by years of war. Armies could conquer, laws could unify, and standards could synchronize daily life, yet none of it would last unless the land itself carried his presence. And so the emperor turned his gaze toward the mountains, plains, deserts, and river valleys, imagining them not as barriers, but as spaces awaiting connection. At dawn, workers climbed cliffs with ropes biting into their palms, carving pathways where none had existed. The rising sun illuminated lines of laborers, stretching like threads across the terrain, some breaking stone, others laying foundations, others hammering beams into place. These scenes unfolded across hundreds of miles, creating a vision of ceaseless motion. It was as if the earth itself was being rewritten. In the north, the early Great Wall began to take form, not as the iconic structure known today, but as connected fortifications, walls, trenches, rammed earth bastions, and watchtowers positioned to watch the horizon with sleepless eyes. These watchtowers, tall and stark, stood like frozen sentinels guarding the edges of the empire. Their presence alone conveyed a message. The emperor's gaze could reach even the most remote wind-scoured pass. Fires could be lit atop them to warn of danger, and the signals would leap from one tower to the next in bursts of flame that travelled quicker than messengers. Beyond their defensive purpose, they served as reminders that no part of the land lay forgotten. Even in solitude, even in silence, the empire was watching. But the walls were only one strand in a much larger web. Roads formed the next. Qin engineers built them with uncompromising straightness, as if the land had no right to curve beneath imperial intention. Wide, hard-packed, and raised slightly above the surrounding earth, these roads slashed across mountains and plains, binding distant cities into a single network. Travelers who once trekked through mud, rock, or unpredictable forest paths now followed a surface so consistent it seemed unnatural. From atop hills, the roads resembled dark strokes of brush, painted across the landscape in deliberate lines that always pointed back to the capital. For soldiers, these roads became arteries of impossible speed. Units that once required weeks to reposition could now cross regions in days. Supply wagons rolled forward with dependable momentum. Generals could respond to threats almost before rebels understood what they had provoked. The roads extended Qin Shi Huangdi's reach, not through intimidation, but through relentless mobility. Distance lost meaning. Hesitation lost value. The emperor's will, transmitted through orders and couriers, moved with a certainty that stunned rival states and left local uprisings gasping for breath. Fortresses rose at key intersections, their walls thick and squared, their interiors stocked with supplies that could last months. From these strong points, the empire projected power across valleys and river crossings. To the common traveller, they might have seemed reassuring safe havens along a demanding journey. But to rebels or conspirators, they were obstacles of stone, positioned precisely to disrupt any hope of sustained resistance. The empire did not need to crush uprisings swiftly. It only needed to make rebellion seem futile before it began. Yet beneath all this practical strength lay a quieter, subtler intention. Each structure, wall, road, tower, fortress, carried an invisible weight. They were symbols of order imposed upon nature, reminders that the emperor's authority reached into the soil itself. Even the silence along the empty stretches of road felt curated, as though the empire had arranged the landscape to echo its own discipline. Local cultures that once thrived in isolation now found themselves tied into a vast network. Movement was no longer purely local, it became imperial. People could feel the shift not just in their lives, but in the terrain beneath their feet. These projects did not roar with triumph. They whispered inevitability. A rebellion might flicker, but a garrison was always near. A message might falter, but the roads offered new routes. A border might weaken, but the watchtowers saw everything. Over time, the infrastructure came to resemble veins and bones, an internal architecture that supported the empire's enormous body long after individual rulers passed. And as the land grew more connected, the emperor's influence seeped into corners once unreachable. The physical world had been reshaped. But next, Qin Shi Huangdi sought to alter something even more elusive: the thoughts of the people themselves. The order did not arrive with thunder or spectacle. It came quietly, sealed with the emperor's authority, carried through corridors to officials who read the words with tightening throats. The decree stated that certain writings, histories, philosophies, teachings of rival schools were to be removed from circulation. They were not banned with outrage or dramatic condemnation. They were simply deemed unnecessary, unhelpful to the unity the emperor envisioned. What followed unfolded not like a riotous purge, but like a long, cold exhale spreading across the empire. Scholars sensed the shift before the first fire was lit. For weeks, they gathered in hidden rooms, whispering over ancient scrolls by flickering lamplight. These texts had survived generations of conflict, carried through wars, passed from master to student with reverence. Now, for the first time, the knowledge they guarded had become dangerous. They debated whether to hide their scrolls or surrender them. Some wrapped precious manuscripts in cloth and buried them in the earth. Others tucked pages into roof beams, praying that time, not flames, would claim them. And some, heartbroken yet resigned, delivered their libraries to local officials, aware that defiance brought consequences far heavier than loss. The fires themselves were eerily controlled. Not wild blazes devouring cities, but contained pits, trenches, and courtyards where collected scrolls were fed into supervised flames. Officials read lists aloud, while attendants added bundles of bamboo slips to the growing piles. The crackling sounded almost ceremonial, like offerings made to an unseen force. Smoke drifted upward in thin ribbons, carrying words that had guided students for centuries. Theories on governance, arguments for virtue, reflections on human nature. They vanished into air, as if knowledge itself could be erased from the world by simple combustion. The emperor's reasoning was ruthlessly consistent. In his mind, unity demanded singularity. The warring states had been fragmented not only by borders, but by competing philosophies. Confucians debating the meaning of duty, Mohists arguing for universal love, Taoists urging withdrawal from structure. To Qin Shi Huang, these divergent ideas weakened the coherence he fought to create. They invited comparison, fostered nostalgia, and encouraged people to imagine alternatives to the present. Books, then, were not harmless artifacts. They were seeds of discord. By restricting which texts could survive, he sought to compress intellectual life into a form that would not challenge his order. To many, this was not simply political control. It was a reshaping of memory. Without written accounts challenging the official narrative, the emperor could cast the past in whatever light strengthened the future he desired. Histories critical of authority vanished. Records praising rival rulers disappeared. Philosophical arguments that placed moral restraint on leadership flickered away in the fire. The silence that followed felt deeper than the absence of sound. It was a vacuum where debate had once lived. Those who watched the burnings felt the weight of something immense slipping away. Elders who had spent their lives teaching blinked at the flames with hollow eyes. Students stood nearby, torn between fear and mourning. Even some officials, though loyal, felt unease as they witnessed wisdom reduced to smoke. But no one spoke openly. The fear of punishment threaded itself through every gathering, every conversation. People learned quickly to guard their thoughts, to lower their eyes when philosophy arose, to speak only of the present and never of what once was. The burnings were not total. Practical knowledge, agriculture, medicine, divination was spared. But the loss of cultural discourse struck with lasting force. Ideas that once shaped identity now survived only in fragmented memory. Teachers turned their lessons inward, passing oral knowledge to trusted students in coded phrases. The empire's intellectual life narrowed like a river forced through a tight canyon. Yet, to the emperor, the effect was stabilizing. With fewer ideological currents pulling people in different directions, the empire felt more coherent. He did not see destruction. He saw simplification. He believed he had removed turbulence from the minds of millions. And in a way, he had at a cost that would echo for centuries. With ideas silenced and the past pruned to fit imperial design, the emperor turned next to the minds that held those ideas, the scholars whose voices he could not afford to leave untouched. The burnings had quieted the written world, but the emperor knew ideas did not live on paper alone. They lived in the minds of those who taught, questioned, remembered, and compared. And so, when whispers of dissent began drifting through the capital, the tension in the court deepened. Scholars who once debated freely now gathered in small, cautious clusters. their conversations ending abruptly whenever footsteps echoed nearby. Even loyal officials sensed a shift, an invisible boundary tightening around acceptable thought. The summons often came at night. Messengers, accompanied by guards, knocked softly on doors that opened with trembling hands. Scholars were escorted through shadowed corridors lit by torches that flickered like uneasy hearts. Some believed they were called to discuss policy, others feared the verdict already formed. In the audience halls, the atmosphere felt colder than before. Discussions, once rich with layered arguments, now unfolded under watchful stares. A question posed too boldly lingered in the air like a challenge no one wished to acknowledge. A few scholars, unwilling to yield, invoked the ancient teachings they believed anchored moral order. They spoke of rituals meant to restrain rulers, of traditions that balanced power with principle, of histories proving that authority without restraint collapsed under its own weight. Their words were not rebellious in intent, they were earnest warnings rooted in the very wisdom the empire had built upon. Yet to Qin Shi Huang, these voices felt like cracks beneath a polished surface. They reminded him of a past he sought to extinguish, a world where competing philosophies had fueled division. He did not hear guidance, he heard threat. Court debates grew sharper. Ministers aligned themselves carefully, knowing that a misplaced comment could imperil their future. The emperor's patience, once firm, began to thin. He viewed dissent as a re-emergence of the disorder that had shaped his early life, a force he believed he had been destined to eliminate. In this mindset, disagreement became disloyalty, and intellectual independence became dangerous. The scholars who persisted, even politely, found themselves marked. Punishments followed, some recorded clearly, others remembered only through rumor. Certain scholars were banished to remote regions where their voices would fade. Others were imprisoned, their teachings silenced behind stone walls. And some, according to later accounts, faced far harsher fates: buried, executed, erased. Whether every detail was literal or shaped by time, the psychological truth remained unmistakable. The emperor was willing to sacrifice wisdom to safeguard unity. Stability, as he defined it, demanded the narrowing of minds. The city felt the change. Students walked with lowered gazes. Teachers chose their words with surgical care. Families who once boasted of scholarly lineage now spoke of it in hushed tones, uncertain whether pride had become peril. Even the air in the academies seemed stiller, as though thought itself feared drawing attention. The absence of debate cast a long shadow over intellectual life, a silence that suggested something essential had been quietly severed. Yet the most haunting part was not the suppression itself, but the calm method with which it was carried out. There were no chaotic purges, no frenzied mobs. Instead, there was procedure controlled, deliberate, almost administrative. Dissent was not crushed with rage, but absorbed into a system designed to eliminate inconsistencies. The emperor did not see his actions as cruelty. He saw them as necessary corrections, adjustments required to maintain the order he had fought so hard to build. For those watching, the message became clear. Truth could exist only if it served unity. Thought could survive only if it aligned with the emperor's vision. The scholar's fate, whether buried in earth or buried in silence, revealed a chilling reality. The empire could tolerate ignorance, but not contradiction. With minds subdued and voices dimmed, the emperor turned towards something even more elusive. Knowledge had been controlled. Now he sought to challenge the one force that had defied every ruler before him, the natural boundary separating life from death. For most rulers, the end of a long reign brings reflection. For Qin Shi Huang, it brought fear, quiet at first, then consuming. The empire he had carved from fractured kingdoms finally stood whole, its laws aligned, its roads stretching like veins across a disciplined body. Yet the man who commanded this new world felt time pressing against him with increasing weight. He could standardize measures, rewrite scripts, and instruct millions to follow a single order, but he could not command the years. Each passing season felt like a reminder that the empire might outlive its maker, drifting back into chaos the moment he loosened his grip. And so the emperor's gaze, once fixed on the land, turned inward toward the one threat no army could conquer. The search for immortality began quietly. Alchemists, mystics, and wandering healers were summoned to the court, their footsteps echoing through halls where scholars once debated. They arrived carrying scrolls of esoteric formulas, powders that shimmered strangely in lamplight, and tales of herbs found only on remote cliffs. Some promised longevity, others promised transformation. Each claimed their method could halt decay and keep the emperor's spirit tethered to his body. Qin Shi Huang listened to all of them with an intensity that surprised even his closest ministers. It was not the curiosity of a ruler hoping for novelty, it was desperation hidden beneath composure. Soon, expeditions were launched to search for mythical islands, said to hold the elixir of life. Ships left the eastern coast, slicing across misty waters toward legends whispered since ancient times. Sailors spoke of mountains rising from the sea, forests glowing with strange light, and immortals who lived beyond the reach of death. Whether these tales arose from hope or exhaustion no longer mattered. They were carried back to the emperor as proof that more must be sought. Each failed journey only deepened his conviction that the answer lay just beyond reach, waiting for a more persistent seeker. Within the palace, alchemists worked under the weight of immense expectation. They mixed minerals, herbs, and metals into shimmering concoctions that promised eternity. Among their ingredients was Mercury, believed to contain transformative power. The emperor drank these potions in measured doses, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge that the substance that glittered like liquid silver carried poison with each swallow. To those watching, his pursuit began to leave marks. Restless nights, unpredictable decisions, and a growing shadow beneath his eyes. But no one dared question the path he walked. To challenge his quest was to suggest he could die, and such a suggestion bordered on treason. Yet beneath the surface of obsession lay vulnerability. Qin Shi Huang had unified the world he knew, erased old divisions, and imposed order where chaos once reigned. But the more he shaped the empire, the more he feared what would happen in his absence. He imagined rival factions tearing apart the structure he had spent years constructing, imagined feuds erupting like dormant fires reignited. Death, to him, was not simply an end, it was a release of control that could unravel everything. His quest for immortality was less about extending his life than protecting the empire from what he believed would follow without his guiding hand. He grew increasingly withdrawn, seeking omens and signs, consulting diviners who read the patterns of stars and bones. Some nights he walked the palace corridors alone, touching the cold stone walls as if searching for reassurance, as if the empire could speak to him. On others, he opened ancient texts about spirits and cosmic cycles, not for wisdom, but for fragments of hope buried between the lines. Ministers observed these shifts with unease. They had seen the emperor at his strongest, decisive, sharp, unwavering. Now they saw a man haunted by the enormity of his own creation. Still, he pressed onward. Expeditions continued, elixirs flowed, rituals multiplied. To outsiders, these efforts seemed irrational, yet to the emperor they formed a coherent strategy. If death threatened the stability of the empire, survival was the final act of leadership. Eternity became duty. But eternity did not come. Instead, his search opened the path to a different kind of immortality, one built beneath the earth. As his health fluctuated, his mind drifted toward the idea of a sanctuary where he might continue ruling even after the body failed. A world crafted to mirror the empire above, a fortress no enemy could breach. His pursuit of life had led him to the threshold of death, and beyond that threshold, he envisioned a kingdom built for eternity. Long before his final breath, Qin Shi Huang began preparing the world he would inhabit after death. To him, the afterlife was not a realm of spirits or drifting shadows. It was another territory, one that required the same precision, structure, and command as the empire above. If he could not escape death, he would at least dictate the landscape that awaited him. And so, beneath the quiet fields outside the future capital of Xi'an, architects and laborers gathered to construct a kingdom carved from darkness. The descent into this vision began at dusk, when the last traces of sunlight slipped behind the hills. Thousands of workers moved underground carrying tools, timbers, and torches whose flames quivered against rough earthen walls. They entered a subterranean world that grew deeper each day, where chambers expanded like the branches of a hidden tree. Overseers marked the ground with careful measurements, mapping out halls wide enough for processions that would never walk them, and rooms spacious enough to host an eternal court. Each corridor was shaped with purpose. Each chamber answered a need the emperor believed would continue after death. It was not a tomb, it was a continuation. The emperor's vision began with geography. He imagined an underground empire mirroring the one he ruled in life. Palaces arranged in proper alignment, administrative halls positioned according to celestial patterns, and protective structures encircling them, like the defensive grid of his capital. At the center stood the chamber, meant for him, a vast space sealed beneath layers of stone and earth. According to accounts passed down through centuries, rivers of Mercury were poured into channels to represent the oceans and waterways of the known world. Their toxic sheen glimmered in torchlight as workers shaped their flow, unaware that the shimmering liquid would one day become one of the most haunting clues to the emperor's intentions. Above these rivers, the ceiling was said to be adorned with constellations, an imitation sky set in darkness, crafted from precious stones and metals. This celestial map, though unseen today, reflected the emperor's belief that his rule extended beyond the earth. In life he had unified the land, in death he intended to command the heavens. The tomb became a convergence of myth and engineering, a space where cosmology and control blended seamlessly. It was an empire condensed into stone. The secrecy surrounding the project was almost absolute. Plans were drawn late at night, illuminated by flickering lamps that cast long shadows over the parchment. Engineers consulted astronomical charts, geomancers traced unseen currents of energy through the soil, and artisans crafted sculptures meant to accompany the emperor into eternity. None of these workers knew the full design. Each saw only the fragment they were assigned. But together, unwittingly, they shaped a world that no living citizen would ever witness. Above ground, the emperor rarely spoke of the project directly, but those close to him understood its logic. If his earthly empire was the pinnacle of order, its perfection should not dissolve with his death. The tomb was his solution, a sealed kingdom where time would not erode his authority. By constructing an environment he could rule forever, he hoped to deny death the chaos it so often brought to dynasties. The project thus became a physical manifestation of his deepest fear, that everything he had built would fracture the moment he was no longer present to hold it together. The labor continued for decades. Generations of workers lived and died, contributing to a structure they would never see completed. Some carved passageways that twisted deep into the earth. Others laid bricks for inner walls meant to protect chambers no living person would enter again. Every stone placed, every corridor shaped, echoed the emperor's obsession. The deeper the tomb grew, the more it resembled a reverse mountain, a monumental world inverted beneath the earth, hidden rather than elevated, protected rather than displayed. Within its depths, the emperor's vision gained a strange, dreamlike coherence. Here, the borders of life and death seemed negotiable. Here, architecture became an extension of ambition. And here, the desire for eternity solidified into walls that still resist the probing tools of modern archaeologists. In this underground realm, he attempted to halt the one force he could not conquer: the erosion of time. But even an eternal kingdom requires guardians, and the emperor did not intend to face the afterlife alone. Beyond these shadowed halls, deeper in the tomb complex, waited a force crafted to protect him for all eternity. Long before their discovery, the soldiers slept beneath the soil, standing in perfect silence, their ranks stretching into darkness with a patience no living army could maintain. Today they seem like artifacts, arranged neatly for modern eyes. But in the beginning, they were something far more haunting, a force crafted not for display, but for eternity. Qin Shi Huang did not trust generals, ministers, or even his own descendants to protect him in death. He trusted stone. And so thousands of soldiers were shaped from earth, molded into forms that echoed the living warriors who once marched under his banners. The creation of the army began in vast workshops hidden from ordinary citizens. Furnaces burned day and night, their smoke rising into the sky like muted breaths. Artisans, overseers, sculptors, and laborers worked in coordinated rhythm. Some shaped limbs from molds, others carved details by hand. Faces were given individuality, some stern, some contemplative, some weary, as if recalling battles fought long ago. Armor plates were pressed with patterns to indicate rank. Hairstyles reflected regional origins. Even the soles of their shoes bore careful texture. Each figure resembled a person who had once lived, though none were portraits. Instead, they were possibilities idealized soldiers for an idealized army. The burial pits were arranged like real military formations. Commanders stood at the front, their posture straight, their gaze unwavering. Infantry filled the central ranks, shields at the ready, spears angled with poised discipline. Archers knelt in staggered rows, frozen at the moment before release. Horses, sculpted with taut muscles and flared nostrils, were placed mid-step, creating the illusion of motion suspended in stillness. Chariots stood behind them, quiet yet prepared, as though a single whispered command might set the entire formation in motion once more. The soldiers were not meant to intimidate the living. They existed for a world no living person was meant to witness. Their presence spoke of the emperor's fear as much as his power. In life, Qin Shi Huang controlled generals through a strict merit system, doubting loyalty even when victories were won. In death, he demanded guards who would never question him, never scheme, never fail. Stone could not betray him. Stone could not forget its purpose. And so he surrounded himself with figures crafted to embody absolute obedience. The logistical brilliance behind the army mirrored the empire's strength. Workshops produced standardized parts, hands, torsos, legs, that artisans then refined. Pigments were applied in vivid colors: blues, reds, greens, purples. Though these hues faded long ago, the soldiers once stood vibrant as if dressed for grand review. Their weapons were real bronze blades, sharpened, balanced, and coated to resist decay. Rows of these weapons were buried alongside the troops, suggesting not symbolism but readiness. Even in death, the emperor expected danger. The pits themselves were sealed with layers of timber, soil, and stone, creating chambers that mimicked the order of military encampments. Workers who dug the trenches understood that once their tasks were complete, they would never see the army again. Some stories claim many were sealed inside to maintain secrecy, a tale blurred by legends, yet one that reveals the chilling reverence surrounding the emperor's afterlife defenses. Whatever the truth, the silence that settled over the site afterward was absolute. Centuries passed, dynasties rose and fell, but beneath the fields, the soldiers remained exactly as they had been positioned, untouched by time, still awaiting orders that would never come. What makes the Terracotta Army so unsettling is not merely its size, but its intention. These figures were not created for beauty, though they possess it. They were built for duty. Each face carries a calm solemnity, as though aware of the eternity imposed upon them. The stillness in their eyes is not lifeless, it is the stillness of purpose. Together, they form a force that bridges two worlds, the empire above and the empire the first emperor envisioned beneath the earth. To stand before them now is to glimpse the depth of the emperor's mind, his control, his fear, his relentless pursuit of permanence. This army is both monument and message, a testament to the belief that power should outlast mortality. And as we move deeper into the tomb complex, past the rows of silent guardians, the path leads toward chambers even more mysterious, where the emperor's final secrets lie waiting in darkness. Deep beneath the fields of Xi'an lies a world no living ruler ever walked, a world shaped by fear, ambition, and the emperor's final attempt to command eternity. The Terracotta Army stands as its outer guard, but beyond those ranks stretch passages that descend into deeper silence, toward chambers sealed so carefully that more than 2,000 years have passed, without a single human gaze disturbing their darkness. These hidden spaces form the heart of the emperor's afterlife kingdom, and though no one has entered them, fragments from ancient texts and modern science reveal hints of what waits inside. Historical records describe a central chamber unlike anything built above ground. According to Sima Qian, the historian who wrote decades after the emperor's death, the tomb contained rivers and seas made of flowing mercury channels of liquid metal representing the Yangtze, the Yellow River, and the distant oceans that marked the edges of the known world. These rivers were said to move, stirred by mechanical devices, shimmering in the torchlight as if restless with their own currents. Whether the machinery still exists, or whether the mercury lies still in the dark, no one knows. But soil tests around the mound show elevated levels of mercury, a quiet confirmation that legend and engineering may not be so far apart. Above the rivers, the ceiling of the central chamber was rumored to hold the cosmos itself. Stars crafted from pearls and gemstones were embedded into a darkened sky, mapping constellations exactly as they appeared during the emperor's reign. It was a universe built indoors, a sky frozen in time for a ruler who feared the heavens might shift without his permission. In life, Qin Shi Huang had reorganized the world. In death, he intended to reorganize the heavens. The chamber, if it still exists intact, is a complete cosmological vision, an empire reflected in miniature, balanced between earth and stars. Surrounding this heart are additional chambers whose purposes remain uncertain. Some believe they hold treasures sealed away from sunlight. Others imagine traps and mechanisms engineered to deter intruders, perhaps still functional after millennia. The architecture was designed with secrecy as a guiding principle. Workers who constructed the deepest areas reportedly never returned, their knowledge buried with their labor. What they built remains a mystery. We can only imagine corridors lined with bronze fittings, sealed doors reinforced with stone, and perhaps offerings never meant to be disturbed. Modern archaeology stands at a threshold. The technology exists to probe deeper, to pierce some of the soil, to view faint outlines through scans. Yet the chamber itself remains unopened. The hesitation stems from two truths, scientific and emotional. First, the tomb's contents are extremely fragile. Even the terracotta warriors lost their colors within moments of excavation, pigments evaporating when touched by air. The central chamber, if exposed, might lose its ancient atmosphere, causing priceless materials to decay instantly. Second, there is an almost spiritual caution, a sense that disturbing the emperor's final world carries moral weight. The tomb was built to be sealed forever. Opening it would not simply reveal history, it would break a promise imposed by the hands that buried him. And there is danger. High mercury concentrations in the soil raise questions about toxicity. If the chamber truly contains vast lakes of mercury, exposure could be deadly. Archaeologists must grapple not only with preservation, but with physical risk, an invisible threat that mirrors the paranoia that fueled the tomb's design. So the hidden chambers remain untouched. They sit beneath the mound, locked behind earth and time, holding secrets that might rewrite our understanding of the ancient world. Each year, researchers debate when or whether the moment of excavation should come. But for now, the emperor's final kingdom remains sealed, an echo of ambition waiting in darkness. From this realm of silence and secrecy, the story must return to the surface, where the empire he forged begins to fracture under the weight of its own perfection. Beneath the polished image of the Qin Empire, its smooth roads, its tall fortresses, its perfect measurements, ran a quieter reality, one that did not appear in official records or triumphant inscriptions. It existed in the strained breaths of laborers, in the hollowed villages left behind by imperial drafts, and in the weary silence of families watching sons disappear into state projects that seemed to multiply with every season. For years, the emperor had shaped the empire into a single, disciplined organism. But now, the weight of that vision pressed down on the very people who held it up. The Great Wall, the vast network of imperial roads, the expanding fortifications, the colossal tomb beneath the earth all demanded bodies. So labor was taken not only from criminals or conquered populations, but from ordinary households. Farmers who once tended quiet fields were marched into work crews, handed tools instead of plows, and assigned to tasks that stretched for miles. Some dug trenches through mountain rock, others hauled timber or fashioned bricks under relentless supervision. They worked through harsh winters and suffocating summers, their lives swallowed by projects they would never see completed. Village life slowly unraveled. Markets grew thinner, not because goods were scarce, but because hands were missing. Homes that once buzzed with the sound of daily tasks now echoed with absence. Mothers scanned the horizon each evening, hoping to see familiar silhouettes returning down the roads. Many never did. Overwork, disease, accidents, and exhaustion claimed countless lives, but the empire's records rarely mentioned such losses. The system saw only output, not the cost. Taxation added another layer of strain. The emperor's reforms demanded precision. Every household accounted for, every grain measured, every acre recorded. Taxes became predictable but unyielding. In good years, families managed. In hard years, they felt the grip tighten. Although the state's intentions were order and fairness, the reality felt suffocating. People learned to fear officials carrying tablets and scrolls more than they feared raiders or bandits of generations past. Surveillance deepened the pressure. With newly standardized laws, and a network of administrators appointed directly by the central government, the empire wove itself into the daily lives of its citizens. Neighbors reported on one another, hoping to protect themselves from punishment. Rumors traveled faster than truth. Even in their own homes, people began to speak carefully, lowering their voices when discussing the burdens imposed by distant authorities. The fear of stepping out of line became another invisible tax one paid with emotion rather than coin. Yet the resentment that spread across the empire did not ignite into rebellion overnight. It simmered. It pressed inward. It settled like dust on weary shoulders. Most people were too afraid to resist directly, too aware of the consequences of defiance. Instead, they carried an exhaustion that grew heavier with each passing year. It appeared in the slowness of their movements, in the quiet moments before dawn, in the sighs that escaped when another imperial decree demanded another round of labor. The empire had united the land, but it had drained the strength of the people who inhabited it. The irony was subtle but unmistakable. The emperor's obsession with perfect order created a system so rigid that any pressure became a threat. Where earlier kingdoms had survived through flexibility and negotiation, Qin relied on discipline and force. When people faltered under the strain, the system did not adjust, it tightened. And in tightening, it revealed its fragility. A tree that bends can survive a storm. One that refuses to bend eventually cracks. In remote regions, minor revolts flickered and died. Officials wrote reports using careful language, disguising unrest as local disturbances. But these flickers signaled something deeper, a shift in mood, a recognition among the people that the emperor who had unified the world no longer seemed able to understand the suffering beneath his grand designs. As the empire stretched past each limit, the emperor's response was not compassion. It was suspicion. He sensed unrest, but misinterpreted its source. Instead of stepping back, he tightened his grip further. Instead of easing burdens, he increased demands. The weight of the empire pressed inward, and the people, unable to cry out, began to break in silence. From this rising exhaustion, from these murmurs in the fields and whispers in the markets, the next chapter emerges, the emperor, sensing threats everywhere, spiraling deeper into paranoia. In the final years of his reign, Qin Shi Huang stood at the height of earthly power, but the walls of his own mind began to bend inward. The man who had once marched with absolute clarity now walked through his palaces as if navigating a shifting dream. Shadows seemed to move when no one approached. Servants learned to walk softly, afraid their footsteps might be mistaken for an assassin's. Ministers measured each word as if the air itself had become dangerous. The emperor, once defined by discipline, now carried a flicker of unease in his eyes that no one dared name aloud. Assassinations had been attempted before, most famously, the near-fatal encounter with Jing Ke. But years later, the memory of that flashing blade still lived inside him, replaying in moments of stillness. What if someone else waited for the right moment? What if the next assassin struck from within the palace itself? These questions followed him from room to room. Guards were increased, then increased again. Hallways were restructured. Servants were restricted to narrower paths. And yet, the emperor felt no safer. Fear seeped into the cracks of certainty he had spent decades building. Omens added to his unrest. Storms that arrived out of season, animals found dead in peculiar positions, even the faint tremor of distant earthquakes each became a message, a warning whispered by a universe he could no longer command. Astrologers were summoned at all hours. Some attempted to reassure him with carefully crafted interpretations. Others, fearing his wrath, merely echoed what they sensed he wanted to hear. But their assurances faded quickly. The emperor believed the heavens were speaking directly, and their language sounded increasingly like accusation. At night, he wandered the palace corridors, while attendants followed at a distance, carrying lanterns that cast unsteady light on the stone walls. He studied the shadows, convinced they hid signs of betrayal. Some nights, he consulted alchemists, demanding new potions, stronger elixirs, formulas that would strengthen his body and silence the ticking of mortality inside him. But the elixirs, many heavy with Mercury, began to alter him. His sleep grew restless, his moods unpredictable. His once sharp intuition became distorted by illness he did not recognize. The poison he believed would preserve him instead intensified the darkness gathering within. Policy shifted with his state of mind, Surveillance spread more aggressively. Decrees became harsher, more sweeping. Punishments for dissent doubled. The empire's vast system of control tightened another notch, not because rebellion surged, but because the emperor believed rebellion lurked behind every whisper. Officials who had once delivered reports, confidently, now spoke in trembling tones. The slightest misstep could lead to demotion, exile, or worse. Fear radiated through the administrative hierarchy, mirroring the fear that consumed the emperor himself. And yet, beneath the harshness, there was tragedy. A quiet one, almost tender in its sorrow. The emperor who had rewritten the order of the world could not steady the disorder within himself. His paranoia was not irrational in the way enemies claimed. It grew from the same instinct that had built his empire, the belief that chaos must be eradicated before it spreads. But now, chaos lived inside him, and he did not know how to fight what he could not see, could not grasp, could not command. His final years became a maze of omens and suspicions. Ministers learned to avoid catching his eye for too long. Servants avoided speaking his name above a whisper. Even the palace animals grew skittish, sensing tension in every corner. The emperor withdrew deeper into rituals, consulting diviners, interpreting cloud shapes, reading signs in the patterns of firelight. He tried to anchor himself in the same order he had imposed on the empire, but the center no longer held. As his mind frayed, his physical strength waned. The elixirs he consumed with unwavering hope corroded his body from within. Yet he insisted on traveling, seeking herbs, islands, and sages who might still offer him a path to eternity. His entourage followed reluctantly, afraid not of the journey itself, but of what it symbolized. A ruler desperately chasing a horizon he could never reach. It is from this fragile, unraveling state that the emperor's final journey begins, a journey that would take him far from the capital, deep into the roads he once built, toward the fate he tried so fiercely to outrun. The emperor's last journey began not with triumph, but with a whisper of desperation. He set out toward the eastern reaches of his empire, following the same coastline where mystics once claimed the islands of immortality drifted across the sea. His procession was immense, rows of guards, alchemists carrying chests of strange powders, ministers concealed within curtained palanquins. Yet despite its size, the column moved with an eerie quiet, as if everyone sensed the fragile curtain between purpose and inevitability growing thinner with each mile. The landscapes he passed were breathtaking. At dawn, mist rose from distant mountains like smoke from sleeping giants. Rivers glimmered beneath bridges his engineers had built. Villages appeared and vanished along the horizon, their inhabitants stepping out to watch the silent passage of the imperial road. From a distance, the procession looked like a moving vein of silver beneath the morning sun, a nation's lifeblood carried eastward. But within its heart, the emperor sat hunched, his breath shallow, his skin pale with the lingering effects of Mercury and fear. He had once travelled these routes with confidence. Now the journey felt elongated, dreamlike. Some days he asked the same question twice, forgetting he had already spoken. Other days he issued commands so strange that ministers quietly ignored them, exchanging worried glances behind their sleeves. Every night, astrologers were summoned to read the sky, though their words blended into one another, unable to soothe his unravelling certainty. The emperor drifted between moments of fierce clarity and long stretches of silence, staring at the sea as if waiting for an omen to rise from the water. The closer the procession moved to the coast, the slower its pace became. His attendants noticed his steps falter, his appetite fade, his hands tremble as he reached for the elixirs he still believed might extend his life. The man who had united the 7 kingdoms now struggled to rise from his bedding. Still, he persisted. Somewhere beyond the horizon, he convinced himself, lay the solution to the one enemy he had never defeated, time. But the sea offered no miracles. The islands stayed hidden, the alchemist's promises proved hollow, and each morning he woke weaker than the last. Ministers began whispering behind their palanquins, not about the quest for immortality, but about succession, unrest, and what might follow if word of his condition spread. No one dared voice the truth aloud. The emperor's final journey had become a slow descent toward death. His entourage pressed onward, hoping movement alone might sustain him. They followed the curves of the coastline, passing cliffs shaped by centuries of wind and tide. They crossed long causeways and rested in outposts, where the ocean's breath seeped into their clothes. But the emperor grew dimmer. His words slurred, his gaze faded. Sometimes, when attendants spoke to him, he seemed to listen from a great distance, as though hearing through a curtain. The empire he had controlled with iron precision now moved far beyond his grasp. One night, in a small seaside command tent, death found him. There was no great storm, no celestial phenomenon, only the sound of waves brushing against the shore. He died as quietly as any man, far from his capital, far from the tomb constructed to hold him forever. For a moment, those gathered around him remained frozen, torn between grief, fear, and calculation. His passing was not merely the loss of a ruler, it was the unraveling of the central knot holding the empire's structure taut. The ministers knew the truth immediately. If the empire learned of his death too soon, chaos would erupt. Rivalries would ignite. Regions already strained by labor and taxation might rebel. So they made a decision both practical and chilling. They sealed his body within his traveling cart, packed it with rotting fish to repel suspicion, and continued the journey as though the emperor still breathed behind the curtains. Soldiers led the way, unaware. Officials bowed when they passed the carriage. The summer heat pressed down on the procession, and the smell of decay, masked by the stronger odor of fish, followed like an invisible shadow. The emperor, once feared across continents, now travelled home concealed within a wooden cart, reduced to secrecy to preserve the illusion of control a little longer. The journey east, meant to defy death, had delivered him straight into its hands. And as the sealed cart rolled slowly back toward the capital, the empire he left behind began to shift beneath the weight of an absence no one dared acknowledge. When the emperor's sealed cart finally reached the capital, the empire did not yet know it had already lost its ruler. Only a handful of ministers, trembling under the weight of secrecy, understood that the man whose will had shaped a continent now lay lifeless behind a curtain. Among them were two figures whose actions would determine the fate of the dynasty. The eunuch Zhao, whose ambition had simmered for years, and the Prime Minister Li Si, whose brilliance had long supported the emperor's reforms. Together, they faced a terrifying question. What happens to a world designed to obey one man, once that man is gone? The emperor's chosen successor, his eldest son Fusu, was far from the capital. He had been stationed at the northern frontier, a deliberate choice meant to shape him into a strong future ruler. But distance also made him vulnerable. Zhao knew that if Fusu returned, the empire would remain strong, guided by a prince trained in the harsh logic of Qin. For Zhao, who felt marginalized and overlooked, such a future held no place for his ambitions. So, he whispered to Li Si that the empire needed stability above all else, and stability could be ensured only by a more pliable heir. Under the weight of fear and uncertainty, Li Si agreed. The forged decree that followed was written in the style of the late emperor, its brushstrokes imitating his command, its language carrying the same rigid authority. It ordered Fusu to take his own life, accusing him of disloyalty. The message reached the northern frontier, and the prince, confused, heartbroken, yet raised in a world where obedience trumped self-preservation, carried out the order. With that single deception, the rightful heir vanished from history, leaving a void ready for manipulation. Into that void stepped the younger son, who elevated hastily to the throne as the second emperor. Unlike his brother, he had not been groomed for leadership. He lacked the discipline and severity that the Qin system demanded. Zhao saw opportunity. Li Si saw necessity. Together, they shaped the new emperor into a figure who nodded at their instructions and signed whatever edicts they placed before him. The empire that had once moved to the clear rhythm of a single will now stumbled under the hands of men who understood power, but not responsibility. The palace transformed into a labyrinth of whispers. Late at night, Zhao and Li Si met behind closed doors, their faces lit by wavering candlelight, debating which officials posed threats and which could be turned into instruments. Loyal ministers who voiced concerns vanished quietly, some imprisoned, others executed, their names scrubbed from records. Decrees grew harsher, punishments more severe. Taxes increased even as the people strained under years of forced labor. Without the emperor's clarity, Qin's laws, once designed to create order, became tools for fear. Hu, overwhelmed, turned inward. He trusted Zhao completely, convinced that the eunuch was the only one capable of guiding him through the demands of imperial rule. Zhao exploited this dependence, isolating the emperor from other advisors, reshaping the palace into a world where only his voice carried meaning. Even Li Si, once the architect of Qin's administrative system, began to sense he had empowered a venom he could not control. The gulf between court and country widened. Provinces sent reports filled with concern, famine in the countryside, unrest among laborers, murmurs of rebellion. But these messages never reached the emperor. Zhao intercepted them, altering or discarding them as he pleased. He issued decrees in the emperor's name, punishing officials who questioned him, creating enemies where once there had been allies. People began to say, in hushed tones, that the empire had two rulers, one who wore the crown and another who wielded its power. Inside the palace, fear replaced loyalty. Ministers did not serve the state, they served survival. Meetings were shorter, voices quieter, decisions more frantic. No one dared contradict Zhao. No one dared reveal the truth. The Qin Dynasty, so mighty under its founder, had begun collapsing from within. The seeds of rebellion had not been planted in distant fields or among forgotten villagers. They sprouted in the imperial court, watered by deceit and ambition. The empire that once felt unbreakable began to creak under the strain. The roads the emperor had built carried not unity, but rumors. The walls meant to protect the land could not shield it from corruption. And the people, watching their burdens grow heavier, began to question whether the empire still served them or only the shadows ruling from behind its throne. From this poisoned core, cracks spread outward, reaching the villages and provinces where patience had worn thin. The next section turns to the moment the people, no longer able to endure the weight of misrule, begin to rise. Rebellion did not arrive with a roar. It began with rain heavy, unrelenting rain that turned roads into rivers and mountains into slick walls of mud. Two conscripted men, Chen Sheng and Wu Guang, were marching with a group of soldiers toward a distant garrison when storms slowed their progress. By the time they realized they would never arrive by the appointed date, a deeper truth settled over them. Qin law allowed no excuses. Lateness, even caused by nature itself, carried the same punishment as treason. Death awaited them at the end of their journey. For most of their lives, these men had obeyed the system, surviving within its rigid boundaries. But now, they stood at the edge of an impossible choice: die for failing to meet an impossible schedule, or defy the empire and meet death on their own terms. Something shifted. Fear, once the empire's guiding force, cracked. The two men gathered their fellow conscripts and spoke aloud a thought many had quietly nurtured. If we must die, let it be for a purpose. In that moment, rebellion sparked not from ideology or ambition, but from desperation, a choice born of exhaustion rather than grand vision. Chen Sheng and Wu Guang raised a banner and declared resistance, not expecting survival, only refusing submission. Yet word spread quickly. Villagers who had lost family members to forced labor recognized their own frustrations in the rebels' defiance. Farmers burdened by taxes heard echoes of their anger. People who had long whispered discontent now found voices in the open air. The rebellion grew with unnerving speed. What began as a small band transformed into a swelling force of thousands. The rebels moved from village to village, not as conquerors, but as reminders of a breaking point reached across the empire. They did not promise victory, only the end of unbearable demands. That promise was enough. Across the empire, similar sparks ignited. Laborers abandoned construction sites, drafted workers fled their posts. Soldiers stationed in distant provinces questioned whether loyalty still served them. Years of strain had built silent reservoirs of frustration, and now those reservoirs ruptured in every direction. The rebellions did not coordinate. They did not follow a central plan. They erupted like brush fires, scattered, unpredictable, and impossible to extinguish once the wind carried them onward. Officials tried to enforce order, but their authority had hollowed. The puppet emperor's decrees were ignored or met with open contempt. Zhao manipulations had fractured trust within the government, leaving commanders confused about whom they actually served. Messages sent to the capital vanished into bureaucratic chaos. For the first time since unification, Qin's network of roads carried not disciplined armies, but waves of unrest. Even regions once loyal to the empire stirred with unease. The people remembered the years of backbreaking labor, the sons who never returned, the officials who punished without mercy, the tomb that swallowed countless lives in its construction. Now, with the founder dead and the court corrupted, the fear that had held the empire together loosened. In its place rose something far stronger: collective exhaustion. Rebellion, once unthinkable, became a rational response. The empire's strength had always depended on absolute order and the belief that resistance was futile. But once the illusion shattered, weakness spread through the system like cracks through glass. Every uprising made the next more likely. Every act of defiance carried the memory of years spent beneath an unforgiving regime. And so the Qin Empire, immense, disciplined, engineered to last, began unraveling not from external enemies, but from the weight of its own people pushing back. The whispers had become shouts, the cracks had become fractures. The fall, once unimaginable, was now inevitable. The collapse of the Qin Empire did not explode outward. It unraveled quietly, like a tightly wound cord finally loosening after years of strain. Rebellions spread across the land, sweeping through valleys and plains the first emperor had once unified with such force. But it was not only the common people who rose. The empire's own structure began to betray itself. Commanders who once marched under Qin's banners now hesitated, uncertain whether loyalty still meant survival. Officials who had enforced the empire's harshest laws began surrendering to rebels rather than defending a court they no longer trusted. In the capital, the second emperor felt power slipping through his fingers like sand. Accustomed to Zhao Gao's guidance, and too frightened to question it, he issued orders that reached almost no one. Governors ignored them. Generals intercepted them. Some messages were altered by Zhao Gao himself, molding reality to fit his paranoia and ambition. The administrative machine that had once been Qin's greatest strength now fractured into pieces, each turning against the others. Ministers who once walked the palace halls with crisp authority now moved quickly and quietly, afraid of becoming the next target of suspicion. The armies, once the pride of the empire, began to crumble. Desertion spread like an infection. Soldiers who had spent years building roads and walls felt no loyalty toward leaders who had drained their strength. Many defected to rebel groups, bringing with them weapons and training that transformed scattered revolts into formidable forces. The Qin military, once a perfectly synchronized machine, lost its rhythm. Command structures collapsed. Messages arrived too late, or not at all. The new emperor, isolated by the manipulations of those around him, lacked the clarity or courage to restore order. The contrast with the first emperor's reign was haunting. It had taken decades of war, labor, reform, and absolute focus to unify China. It took less than a handful of years to tear it apart. Villages that once celebrated the end of the warring states now found themselves choosing between rival banners. Fortresses that symbolized imperial strength opened their gates without resistance. Even the mighty walls that had stretched across the north could not contain the disintegration within. In the heart of the capital, the palace grew strangely quiet. Courtyards that once echoed with precise footsteps now held stillness. Guards abandoned their posts, leaving bronze weapons leaning against stone pillars. Ministers stopped attending morning meetings. The bureaucracy, stripped of direction, drifted into paralysis. Orders from the second emperor lay unread or unexecuted. Decisions dissolved into uncertainty. It was as though the empire, deprived of its founder's iron will, had forgotten how to stand upright. Outside the capital walls, rebel armies grew bolder. They marched through towns that no longer resisted, their numbers swelling with every step. Some groups carried the banner of vengeance. Others sought liberation. Most simply wanted relief from the years of suffering imposed by Qin's unyielding laws. And as they approached the capital, there was little left to oppose them. The defenders who remained lacked conviction. Many surrendered before a single arrow was fired. The moment the rebels reached the capital gate, the scene unfolded with unsettling simplicity. There was no climactic battle, no grand standoff. The gates, once guarded by the strongest army in the ancient world, opened with barely a sound. The rebels stepped through, walking streets designed for imperial processions, now littered with the remnants of abandoned authority. In the palace, the second emperor faced the truth. He had inherited a throne but not the ability to wield it. Cornered by Zhao Gao's manipulations and overwhelmed by the dissolution around him, he met his end quietly. marking the final extinguishing of Qin's fragile legitimacy. Meanwhile, Zhao, whose schemes had fueled the empire's decay, found himself unable to control the chaos he had unleashed. Rebels and officials alike turned against him. His power, built on deception, dissolved the moment people stopped believing in the shadow he cast. His downfall came swiftly, swallowed by the same instability he had helped create. With the second emperor dead, Zhao eliminated, and the central government shattered, the Qin dynasty collapsed into dust. Rival leaders and warlords, some rebels, some opportunists, rose to claim pieces of the fallen empire. China, once bound into a single body, fractured again into competing forces. Roads, once symbolizing unity, now carried messengers of new struggles. Provinces that had tasted rebellion refused to return to silence. The Qin dynasty had been the first attempt to forge China into one. It succeeded brilliantly and failed spectacularly. Its rise took decades. Its fall took moments. In this stark contrast, the audience can sense both the brilliance and the fragility of the system the first emperor created. Power built on fear may command for a time, but it rarely endures once the hand enforcing it disappears. And now, from the ashes of collapse, the story must turn towards something deeper. What remains of a ruler after his empire dies? What parts of his vision survived, and what vanished with the dynasty he forged? When the Qin dynasty fell, it disappeared with startling speed. Palaces burned, documents were seized, and rival warlords carved the land into new territories. Yet even as the physical empire dissolved, something curious remained, behind an invisible architecture woven into the daily life of millions. The dynasty itself vanished, but its ideas quietly continued, moving forward like a tide no rebellion could reverse. In this gentle aftermath, the contours of Qin's legacy became clearer than they had ever been during its brief reign. The first legacy was the written script. Before unification, China was a patchwork of characters and regional styles, each shaped by local custom. Communication across kingdoms required translators, scribes, and guesswork. Qin's standardization simplified that world. Through a deliberate and thorough effort, thousands of complex or regional characters were replaced by a unified writing system. It was clean, functional, and precise, designed for governance rather than poetry. When the dynasty collapsed, later rulers could have abandoned it in favor of older traditions. They did not. The script endured because it worked. It allowed ideas to travel without stumbling over borders. It became the written soul of a civilization that would outlive every dynasty to come. Equally enduring were the measurements. Qin's rulers insisted that distances, weights, and volumes be standardized throughout the realm. No more grain measured one way in the west and another way in the east. No more disputes between merchants from different regions because of conflicting local standards. A foot became a foot everywhere. A pound became a pound everywhere. This simple uniformity, enforced rigidly at the time, later became the quiet foundation of trade, taxation, and engineering. Dynasties rose and fell, but merchants still relied on the weights Qin established. Builders still used its measurements to raise bridges, canals, and palaces. Even the axle width of carts, once standardized, so wheels would fit perfectly along Qin-built ruts, continued to shape the design of roads for generations. The roads themselves lived on as well. When the first emperor demanded a network connecting all corners of the land, he imagined it as a web of control avenues, along which his soldiers, inspectors, and messengers could travel at near impossible speed. After Qin's collapse, those roads lost their military purpose, but not their usefulness. People used them to trade, migrate, visit temples, and carry news of distant events. Later dynasties expanded and repaired them, recognizing their value not as tools of domination, but as arteries of unity. The paths carved through mountains, the bridges spanning wide rivers, these remained long after the banners atop them changed. Even Qin's harsh legal foundations, stripped of their cruelty, persisted in subtler form. The idea that laws should apply to all aristocrats included was revolutionary in its time. Qin enforced it brutally, but later dynasties kept the principle while softening its edges. Centralized bureaucracy, standardized ranks, and merit-based appointments became staples of imperial governance. Though the dynasty itself was remembered as oppressive, its administrative blueprint proved too efficient to discard. Future rulers studied it carefully, adopting what worked and discarding what caused fear. In this way, Qin's governance survived, cleansed of its harshest methods, but anchored to the same skeleton the first emperor had forged. Perhaps the most enduring legacy, though less tangible, was the idea of China as a single entity. Before Qin, the notion of a unified civilization was philosophical at best. People thought of themselves as belonging to their kingdoms, Zhao, Chu, Yan, Qi, each with its own identity. Qin changed that. By force and decree, it shaped an understanding of a shared cultural space, a land bound together not merely by conquest but by roads, walls, writing, and laws. After the dynasty's fall, rival warlords fought fiercely for the throne, not just to rule their regions, but to govern the entirety of all under heaven. The first emperor had planted the idea that China should be one, and that idea endured even when his state did not. In this gentle reflection, a paradox emerges. The harshest empire left the deepest imprint. Qin's methods broke under their own weight, but its vision, order, unity, structure became the inheritance of countless generations. Dynasty after dynasty rebuilt what Qin had begun, refining the dream rather than replacing it. The first emperor's shadow stretched far beyond his lifetime, long past the fall of his dynasty, touching every era that followed. From the legacies that endured, the story now turns toward the opposite side of memory. What was erased, forgotten, or buried beneath the weight of the emperor's ambitions? When the Qin dynasty vanished, it left behind more than ruins, empty palaces, and abandoned roads. It left absences, silent spaces in the fabric of China's cultural memory that could never be filled again. The empire's harshest policies had not only reshaped laws and infrastructure, they had carved deep cuts through the world of ideas. In the soft, reflective quiet following Qin's collapse, it became clear how much had disappeared in its effort to control thought, unify belief, and erase the past it considered dangerous. Across the land, scholars searched for remnants of texts burned during the infamous purges. Many found only ashes. Entire schools of philosophy that once argued, debated, and enriched one another were reduced to fragments. Ritual manuals, ancestral histories, medical writings, and poetic traditions vanished into smoke. Some works survived only through memory passed down in incomplete pieces, missing lines like missing breaths. Others were lost entirely. What remained were gaps, blank spaces where voices should have been, and questions that would never be answered because the evidence had been erased before future generations could inherit it. Rituals practiced for centuries disappeared as well. Local customs swept aside by Qin's unification did not always return once the dynasty fell. Some were forgotten in the rush of new rulers and new wars. Others lingered only in distant villages, reshaped into new forms. The empire's insistence on uniformity, whether in law, measurement, or practice, flattened the rich diversity of a continent-sized civilization. Once those traditions were broken, many could not be revived. Cultural memory, like pottery shattered into dust, could not be pieced together again. Human loss deepened the sorrow. Scholars executed, or driven into hiding, took with them entire lifetimes of learning they had never been allowed to pass on. Families who lost sons to forced labor or punitive laws lost not only loved ones, but the continuity of stories, songs, and lineages. The empire had demanded obedience, but the cost was measured in memories that vanished quietly, unnoticed except by those who once carried them. The past, remade by decree, no longer resembled what had been. Even the land bore scars, sacred groves cut down for roads, ancestral sites destroyed or repurposed, regional arts replaced by standardized forms. Each change left a lingering ache. The Qin dynasty had built with astonishing scale, but its projects sometimes erased the subtler threads that held communities together. Unity had been achieved, but at the price of countless small identities dissolved into a single, overwhelming vision. Perhaps the deepest loss, however, lay in philosophical possibility. Before Qin, the Warring States period had been a golden age of debate. Confucians, Mohists, legalists, Taoists, and countless others argued passionately about the nature of governance, virtue, and humanity. That intellectual richness had shaped the era with extraordinary dynamism. After the purges and persecutions, the field of thought narrowed. Some ideas survived, others flickered out before they could evolve. The empire's desire to control history froze the path of what history might have become. In the quiet centuries that followed, later scholars would often wonder about the missing threads, books referenced but no longer existing, teachings hinted at in surviving texts, philosophical movements with only partial remains. The gaps were not just academic curiosities, they were reminders of how fragile culture can be under the weight of total power. And yet, the sorrow of what was lost is inseparable from the truth of what was achieved. Qin built the first realization of a unified China, but in doing so, it sacrificed diverse memories that might have offered gentler paths forward. The dynasty rose through order, but part of that order came from reshaping the past to make room for its future. From these reflections on loss, the story turns toward the centuries after Qin, when later generations tried to understand, reinterpret, and sometimes reinvent the image of the emperor who changed everything. Long after Qin Shi Huang's empire had vanished, long after the walls he built crumbled, and the men he commanded returned to dust, his presence did not fade. Instead, it grew. With each passing dynasty, his memory stretched into new shapes, absorbing the fears, ambitions, and imaginations of the people who came after him. The man who had once walked the earth as a flesh and blood ruler slowly transformed into something larger, more elusive, a symbol woven into China's cultural memory. The earliest historians of the Han dynasty painted him as a tyrant, a warning carved into ink and bamboo. They needed him to be monstrous. By exaggerating his brutality, they justified their own rise to power and explained the Qin collapse as punishment for excess. In their accounts, he appeared cold, relentless, almost inhuman. His policies were sharpened into cruelty, his ambitions stretched into madness. The Han rulers found him useful not as a figure to admire, but as a shadow to stand against. And so the first layer of his myth was formed through political necessity. Yet the people who lived centuries later saw something different. To many, he became a figure of awe. Folk stories circulated about a king who had breathed order into chaos, who tamed lands that once devoured one another in endless war. In rural villages, elders told tales of his unstoppable armies, his iron laws, his vision that reached beyond mountains. In these stories, he was not a tyrant but a protector, a man who unified the world so that farmers could sleep without fear of raids or shifting borders. Though softened, his image remained powerful, like the low hum of thunder after a storm has passed. As dynasties rose and fell, his story shifted again. Artists and performers recast him in theatre and song. In some plays, he appeared as a tragic figure driven by destiny, undone by his own obsessions. In others, he was a villain who burned books and crushed scholars underfoot. Each retelling reflected the anxieties of its age. When rulers feared rebellion, Qin Shi Huang became a tyrant to condemn. When they sought legitimacy, he became a model of strength and decisive leadership. His memory bent like a reed in the wind, shaped by the needs of those who invoked it. Religious traditions layered new interpretations upon him. Taoist legends claimed he sought immortality not out of fear, but because sages had whispered cosmic secrets into his ear. They imagined him traveling the eastern seas, searching for islands that floated between this world and the divine. In these myths, he brushed against spirits, dragons, and celestial beings, becoming part of a realm where emperors were not merely rulers, but participants in a cosmic drama. His tomb, sealed beneath Earth and Mercury, became a portal in the public imagination, an entrance to a world where the emperor still commanded an army of stone in eternal darkness. Even his failures became symbols. Scholars debated his reign in philosophical texts, using him as a lens for questions about authority, law, and human nature. Was he proof that power corrupts absolutely? Or evidence that harsh order is necessary to hold a fractured world together? Generations of thinkers projected their own dilemmas onto him, finding answers or warnings within his story. The man who once silenced scholars became the subject of their deepest reflections. Centuries later, poets wrote of him with melancholy respect. They described him standing at the edge of the world, staring into the sea, searching for eternity while time slipped through his fingers. They imagined him wandering palace corridors at night, haunted by the weight of the realm he had shaped. These poems blurred fact and feeling, turning the emperor into an archetype. The lonely ruler, the visionary consumed by vision, the mortal who tried to fight the one law no dynasty could rewrite. Even today, his name carries a charge. He is remembered as the unifier and the destroyer, the architect of China, and the breaker of its ancient traditions. His Terracotta Army draws millions, not because of its archaeological value alone, but because visitors sense the presence of a story larger than any single interpretation. People stand before those silent soldiers and feel both wonder and unease, as though they are witnessing a dream carved into clay. Qin Shi Huang's legacy endures because it refuses to settle. He is neither hero nor villain, neither saint nor monster. He is a mirror one that reveals the hopes and fears of every era that gazes into it. His story outlasted his empire because it speaks to something universal: the desire to shape the world and the cost of bending it too forcefully. With the emperor's myth laid bare, the narrative now turns toward its final question: what his life reveals about the nature of power itself, and why stories of absolute rule continue to echo across history. From a distance, Qin Shi Huang appears as an unstoppable force, an emperor who bent a continent to his will, unified warring kingdoms, standardized every corner of life, and carved his dreams into mountains, walls, and the earth itself. But when we step closer, when we quiet the noise of history's judgments, another truth emerges. His power was not born from strength alone, but from fear. Fear of chaos, fear of betrayal, fear of impermanence, fear of time slipping beyond his grasp. To understand his reign, one must begin with the shadows of his childhood. Yingzheng grew up behind walls, built not for protection, but for paranoia. Rumors surrounded his parentage. Assassination attempts were common. Alliances shifted like sand beneath his feet. The world he inherited at birth was fractured, unstable, violently uncertain. A child raised in such an environment does not learn to trust. He learns to control. He learns that safety comes not from love or loyalty, but from eliminating threats before they emerge. This early understanding imprinted itself onto the man he became, and eventually onto an empire. When he ascended the throne as a teenager, his first actions were not grand reforms but subtle movements, studying his ministers, observing their expressions, learning the invisible language of power. He saw how quickly people changed sides, how loyalty dissolved the moment consequences shifted. In a sense, he understood humanity through its vulnerabilities, not its virtues. Power, to him, became less about commanding armies and more about anticipating instability before it surfaced. That same mindset shaped his internal reforms. Standardized writing, strict laws, uniform measurements, these were not merely tools of governance. They were attempts to impose predictability onto a world that had denied him stability as a child. If characters were unified, misunderstandings would disappear. If laws were absolute, treachery would decrease. If roads were straight, messages would reach the capital faster, preventing uprisings before they began. Every reform was a psychological balm, a way to soothe the fear he did not have language for. And yet, in creating this order, he also created brittleness. A flexible system can absorb shock. A rigid one shatters when pushed too far. Qin Shi Huang believed rigidity equaled strength, because his childhood had taught him that softness was vulnerability. So he hardened everything: punishments, expectations, structures, until the entire empire reflected the constraints that had once shaped him. His personal psychology became national policy. During the wars of unification, his fear transformed into ambition. Each conquered kingdom was not simply a victory, it was the removal of another source of uncertainty. Chaos could no longer enter from Zhao, or Chu, or Qi, if they ceased to exist as independent forces. His craving for unity was not fueled merely by political logic. It was emotional. By bringing all under heaven into a single system, he believed he was finally building a world where fear could not reach him. But the deeper truth was that no amount of conquest could contain what frightened him most: time. The warring states had lasted for centuries. Dynasties before his had risen and fallen. Even the greatest rulers were swallowed by the same silence that took peasants and generals alike. Mortality was the one enemy he could not defeat with armies or decrees. And the more he accomplished, the more terrified he became of losing it. This fear of impermanence explains his turn toward immortality. He did not seek eternal life merely out of vanity. He sought it because everything he built felt vulnerable to the cycle of rise and fall. If he could not outlive time, then time would undo his work. It would return the world to chaos. And so he consumed elixirs, summoned alchemists, sent ships across the sea. He searched not just for unending breath, but for a guarantee of stability that no empire in history had ever known. His tomb reflects this psychology more clearly than any text. It was not built as a resting place. It was an insurance policy. If time could not be controlled in life, perhaps it could be controlled in death. The underground palace was a recreation of his world, a sealed, eternal version where rivers flowed in Mercury, stars shone on the ceiling, and soldiers of clay stood guard forever. It was an attempt to freeze the empire at its peak, to create a realm where decay could not reach him. The irony is quiet but devastating. The more he tried to conquer time, the more time conquered him. The Mercury meant to preserve has become a barrier preventing archaeologists from entering. The walls meant to protect his secrets now hide them from the world. The soldiers created to guard him stand in silence, unable to protect the legacy he hoped would endure unchanged. His obsession preserved the tomb but not the dynasty. When we look back at his reign, we see a man whose greatest achievements, unification, standardization, monumental engineering, were born from the same psychology that led to his greatest failures: harsh laws, book burnings, paranoia, and the brittle collapse of his successor state. Strength and flaw intertwined, vision and fear inseparable. His story, when told gently, is not about a tyrant or a hero, but about the human attempt to impose order on a world that resists control. It is about the quiet terror of impermanence, the way childhood trauma can echo across nations, the way brilliance can become dangerous when fused with insecurity. He believed, sincerely, that unity required harshness, that control required fear, and that greatness required the elimination of all unknowns. In trying to stabilize the world, he destabilized the future. In trying to control time, he accelerated change he could not foresee. And yet, the revelation is not that absolute power corrupts absolutely, but that absolute power reveals the deepest truths a person carries. Qin Shi Huang's empire was a mirror of his mind, disciplined, ambitious, visionary, and deeply afraid. The unification of China stands as a testament to his brilliance. Its rapid collapse reveals the fragility beneath that brilliance. As the audience sits with this understanding, the story widens. His psychology is not ancient, it is universal. Every age has figures who fear time, who seek order, who attempt to remake the world according to the shape of their childhood shadows. Qin Shi Huang simply had the power to carve his fears into the landscape itself. From this quiet reflection, the narrative now expands outward to explore what his story teaches the modern world about ambition, fragility, and the limits of control. History often feels distant, its names carved into stone, its lessons softened by centuries. But the story of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China, refuses to remain in the past. His life still pulses beneath the surface of modern society, not because we share his world of bronze weapons and ancient rituals, but because the forces that drove him, fear, ambition, the desire to impose order on chaos, are forces that continue to shape the world today. His story is not only a chronicle of a ruler long gone, it is a mirror held up to power itself. In the quiet, reflective light of this final chapter, we can see his reign as a cautionary tale wrapped in brilliance. Qin Shi Huang unified a fractured land that had known nothing but war for centuries. He standardized writing, measurements, currency, turning a patchwork of kingdoms into a single civilization. He built roads that crossed mountains, walls that traced the horizon, and an administrative system that survived for millennia. In many ways, he shaped the blueprint of modern statecraft. But the same hand that carved order into the world also pressed down too hard. His fear of disorder became the engine of his tyranny. His desire for permanence led him toward impossible quests. His obsession with control created a system so rigid that it shattered the moment he was gone. When we look around today at governments tightening their grip, at leaders using fear to justify control, at societies racing to impose uniformity, we can see echoes of the world he built. The details have changed, but the patterns have not. Every civilization faces the same tension between unity and individuality, between security and freedom, between vision and obsession. The first emperor's life shows us what happens when one side dominates completely. His childhood fear became national policy. Modern societies, too, often legislate fear, reacting to threats with sweeping laws that reshape daily life. Qin Shi Huang responded to chaos by eliminating choice, diversity, and dissent. Today, governments sometimes respond to uncertainty in similar ways, believing that stability requires sacrifice. But his story warns us that control without compassion, order without flexibility, and unity, achieved through pressure rather than trust, will never endure. Systems built this way crack the moment they lose their strongest pillar. His obsession with rewriting the past also feels familiar. Throughout history, and especially in the present, rulers, institutions, and even media reshape narratives to strengthen authority. Qin Shi Huang burned books, erased histories, and silenced competing philosophies to ensure the world reflected only his vision. Today, the rewriting of history rarely involves fire, but the motive is similar: the belief that control over the past ensures control over the future. Yet his legacy reveals the flaw in this logic. Attempts to erase memory often create deeper wounds. Ideas suppressed in one era return in another, sometimes stronger than before. And the gaps left by lost knowledge are never truly filled. They become perpetual reminders of what happens when power fears the truth. His quest for immortality is perhaps the most universal reflection of all. He sought literal eternal life through alchemy and myth, terrified that time would undo his achievements. Today, the methods are different. Technology, medicine, the pursuit of legacy, the obsession with longevity. But the desire is the same. Modern societies pour staggering resources into attempts to extend life, reverse aging, or preserve influence. And yet, Qin Shi Huang's story whispers a quiet truth. No matter how far we reach, time still moves forward. The question is not how long we live, but what remains after we are gone. His tomb, sealed beneath earth and Mercury, is a metaphor for every attempt to preserve legacy through force. It remains unopened, not because it is eternal, but because time has made it fragile. His clay army stands frozen in perfect formation, yet powerless to defend the empire he left behind. They are a reminder that monuments can endure while the systems that created them crumble. A warning that physical symbols of power mean nothing if the structure supporting them is hollow. And yet, his story is not entirely a warning. There is also inspiration in it, evidence that one person's vision can reshape the world in ways they never lived to see. The first emperor unified China, and though his dynasty collapsed quickly, the idea of unity endured. His standardized script allowed future generations to share ideas, record history, and build upon his foundations. His administrative structures influenced governance for over 2,000 years. His ambition carved the possibility of a shared identity into the heart of a civilization. This duality, brilliance and blindness, achievement and fragility, is what gives his story its lasting power. He shows us that greatness is never simple, and that even the most extraordinary achievements carry shadows. His successes remind us what vision can accomplish. His failures remind us what fear can destroy. For modern leaders, his life offers a quiet lesson. Power without empathy collapses. Systems built on fear break quickly. Dreams that ignore human cost become tombs rather than legacies. True stability cannot be forced. True unity cannot be commanded. The greatest structures in history, physical or political, endure not through control, but through balance. For societies, his story poses a different question. What do we choose to remember? What do we allow ourselves to forget? Qin Shi Huang tried to rewrite history, but history rewrote him instead, turning him into myth, warning, symbol, and mirror. We continue to reinterpret him because his story captures something universal about humanity: the tension between order and freedom, vision and humility, creation and destruction. And for individuals, his life offers one final message in the softest voice. No one escapes time, not even emperors. But stories endure, ideas endure. What we build in others, through culture, through language, through the systems we leave behind, last longer than walls, or armies, or the illusions of immortality. Qin Shi Huang wanted eternity. What he achieved was something quieter but far more real: influence. Not the unbroken empire he dreamed of, but a legacy carried by generations who interpreted his story in their own way. The past does not belong to those who try to control it. It belongs to those who learn from it. And so, as the narrative comes to a close, the emperor fades into the distance, his clay soldiers standing watch, his roads stretching into memory, his legend drifting between fear and admiration. Time moves on, but the story remains.